Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have made a commitment to deliver a deal for every part of Scotland. 5 deals are now fully agreed and 4 are agreed in principle. We are in discussion with the Treasury to agree the parameters of the final 2 deals and the role that the deal programme as a whole can play more generally in our economic recovery.
John Stevenson.
The Minister will be aware that the Borderlands is considered a great success. However, to ensure that such initiatives are truly successful and properly implemented requires timely decisions by all parties involved, and I think that's something the Prime Minister certainly wants to see happen. Would the Minister commit to doing everything he can, particularly with regards to the Treasury at the UK level and the Scottish Parliamentary level, to ensure that the Borderlands initiative proceeds quickly and effectively?
Yes, absolutely, and I should add my honourable friend has been an excellent champion of the Borderlands deal. We are making good progress with it, including the consideration of individual projects such as the Dairy Innovation Centre. We hope to be able to agree the terms of a full deal later this year. I should also mention that I'm meeting with the Campaign for the Borders Rail team later this month to discuss that project, and I would greatly welcome my honourable friend's thoughts on that.
Christine Jardine.
Question 17, please.
Minister.
The Government has been working closely with the devolved administrations throughout the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure a coherent UK-wide approach. The Government will shortly announce further details on regulations, including a full list of countries and territories from which arriving passengers will be exempted from the self-isolation requirements.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Edinburgh Airport is not just one of the largest employers in my constituency when taken together with all the cargo handlers, the shops on site. It is a linchpin of Edinburgh's economy and Scotland's economy. During this crisis, 80% of its staff have been furloughed, and it's gone from having 40,000 passengers pass through it on an average day to less than 200, and some days none. And while I'm deeply concerned about the airport, the airlines and the directly related jobs, they also feed into a tourist industry, which is worth an estimated £10.5 billion a year to Scotland. With the loss of the Edinburgh Festival, the Royal Highland Show, the incomplete Six Nations this year, and now the loss of tourism, potentially every job in Edinburgh is under threat. Will this government use its economic...
Come on, Minister, come on.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the honourable lady's question, and I do know the importance that Edinburgh Airport and her constituency has, not just for the airport but the wider economy. I'd be very happy to meet her to discuss the specific points she has in further detail, but the global airline industry is facing a huge challenge, and it will require considerable efforts to get it back on its feet.
Thank you, Speaker. Question 18.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 18, 19 and 20 together. The Government has always stressed the importance of the Union, and the current crisis demonstrates the value in responding collectively. We have world-leading expertise and economic strength to support jobs and business with generous financial packages. It is the strength of our Union which will enable us to rebuild our economy quickly and fairly.
I thank my good friend, the new Minister, and congratulate him on being at the dispatch box. Devolution in Scotland has given the Scottish people a localised legislative body. It gives Scottish people greater powers over their own affairs and is replicated in Northern Ireland and Wales. Does my honourable friend agree that this has caused a democratic deficit for England, and as devolution is now being revisited in my own constituency county of Greater Lincolnshire, what lessons can be learned from Scottish devolution to give the people of Lincolnshire greater powers over their own affairs?
My honourable friend is right to highlight the considerable powers that have been devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but England has also seen significant devolution, and that is a process which continues with further deals in the pipeline and the Government's commitment to a white paper on devolution in England. I would suggest that devolution has given Scotland the best of both worlds, localising decision-making but being able to access the collective resources of a strong United Kingdom.
Sarah Downs.
Mr. Speaker, more than 60% of Scottish exports go to the rest of the UK. That represents 3 times more than the rest of the EU. Does my right honourable friend agree that as we emerge from this pandemic, that trade between all 4 of the home nations is going to be critical, not only to Scotland, but to the rest of the UK?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight these figures. We do not need the barriers and division that separation would bring, nor do we need the reckless talk of effectively closing the border when tourism in Scotland needs all the help it can get.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Scottish Government's decision to put off its preparations for a second Scottish referendum on independence while dealing with the coronavirus. Does the Minister agree that once this pandemic is over, those plans will still be unnecessary and still be unwanted by the people of Scotland?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The last thing Scotland needs is the uncertainty and division that another referendum would bring.
Right, that's the end of Scottish questions. We are now going to come to questions to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister. I call Richard Graham.
Number one, please.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, may I start by commending the Together initiative for organising this coming Sunday what will hopefully be the nation's biggest ever thank you day to mark the birthday of the NHS. It will provide the perfect moment to thank not just our amazing NHS and care workers, but also those key workers who have helped in the national effort throughout our fight against coronavirus, and indeed all those across the country who have gone the extra mile for their local communities in these challenging times. I'm sure we can agree across this House that the NHS represents the very best of us and that we will always be there to support it. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister says, today is the 72nd anniversary of the NHS and a good moment for us all to appreciate the immense role of the NHS in all our constituencies, perhaps especially the Gloucestershire Royal Hospital, which has put up with me as a summer volunteer for the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's launch of the UK New Deal yesterday paves the way for exciting new projects. Can I highlight for his attention the proposed Eco Park and Green Energy Park in Gloucester, which may need a little of the Chancellor's oil? And can I also highlight, should it be approved, the shovel-ready new Gloucester to Cheltenham cycleway, which I hope that he might accept an invitation to come and open with my honourable friend for Cheltenham and I when it is ready.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend very much for that question, and I congratulate him on what he's doing to support the wonderful new Eco and Green Energy Park, and I look forward to joining him on the new cycleway in due course.
We now can Right Honourable Sir Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I too celebrate the birthday of the NHS, as we all will, this Sunday, particularly at this time? Mr. Speaker, at the daily press conference on the 18th of June, the Health Secretary said there's an outbreak of COVID-19 right now in parts of Leicester. Yet it was only on Monday evening this week that the government introduced restrictions. That's a delay of 11 days, during which the virus was spreading in Leicester. Why was the government so slow to act?
Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, the government first took notice and acted on what was going on in Leicester on the 8th of June, because we could see that there was an issue there. We sent mobile testing units, formal mobile testing units, shortly thereafter. We engaged actively with the authorities in Leicester, with public health in Leicester, with everybody responsible in Leicester, in a way that we've done with other areas that have had similar issues. Unfortunately, in Leicester, it did not prove possible to get the results that we've seen elsewhere. So on Monday, we took the decision which I hope the Right Honourable Gentleman approves of, to go into lockdown in Leicester, because I've been absolutely clear with the House and with the country that we are going forward. We've made huge progress, but where necessary, we will put on the brakes. We acted decisively, and I think it was the right thing to do.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I do support the government's decision of Monday, but I think the 4,000 businesses and the 160 schools that are now shut might take some persuading that the government acted quickly enough. One of the problems in Leicester was the local authority only had half of the data. They had data for Pillar 1 COVID tests. That's NHS, care workers and tests in hospitals. They didn't have Pillar 2 tests, the wider tests in the community. Now, that may sound technical, but what that meant was that the local authority thought there were 80 positive tests in the last fortnight, when the real figure was 944. The local authority was only given the real figure last Thursday. So there was a lost week whilst the virus was spreading. There are now real fears, Mr. Speaker, of further local lockdowns across the country. Can the Prime Minister give a cast-iron guarantee today that no other local authority will ever be put in that position again?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid the right honourable gentleman is mistaken, because both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 data have been shared not just with Leicester but with all authorities, Mr. Speaker, across the country. And we did in Leicester exactly what we did, for instance, Mr. Speaker, in Kirklees or in Bradford or in Weston-super-Mare or other places where very effective whack-a-mole strategies have been put in place for reasons that I think the House will probably understand. There were particular problems in Leicester in implementing the advice and getting people to understand what was necessary to do. But let's face it, we've had to act, the government has acted, and he wants to know whether we'll act in future, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we protect the health of the entire country. And I can tell him that we will. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the Mayor of Leicester this morning, and I know the Prime Minister spoke to him yesterday, and it's absolutely clear that he didn't get that data till last Thursday. I doubt he told the Prime Minister something different yesterday. The Prime Minister can't just bat away challenge. These are matters of life and death and the people's livelihoods. An example of this, Mr. Speaker, last week, the member for Hove asked the Prime Minister, how can seaside towns be expected to cope with likely influx of visitors to beaches and parks during the hot weather? The Prime Minister replied, show some guts. 2 days later, Bournemouth Beach was closed with 500,000 visitors. A major incident was declared. Does the Prime Minister now regret being so flippant?
Prime Minister.
I really think that the right honourable gentleman does not distinguish himself by his question, because I was making it absolutely clear that as we go forward with our plan, our cautious plan for opening up the economy, it is very, very important that people who do represent seaside communities, places where UK tourists will want to go, should be as welcoming as they can possibly be. That was the message I think is important to set out. But it is also vital that people have to behave responsibly. Yeah. And that is why the scenes in Bournemouth were completely unacceptable, and that is why we stick to the advice that we have given. And I made it absolutely clear that people, if they're going to travel to the seaside, if they're going to take advantage of the easing of the lockdown, then they must observe social distancing, and it is everybody's responsibility to ensure that is the case.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister must understand why this is of such concern. There's nationwide lifting of restrictions this weekend. Without an app, without clear data for local authorities, or the world-beating system we were promised. Last week, I do support it, but I'm not blind. I support the easing of restrictions, but unlike the Prime Minister, I'm not blind to the risks. And I don't think anybody else should be. Two-thirds. Last week, I pointed out to the Prime Minister that two-thirds of people with COVID-19 are not being reached and asked to provide their contact details. The Prime Minister typically said it was all a stunning success. The updated figures now show that things have got worse. Of the 22,000 new cases of COVID infections per week in mid-June, just 5,000 were reached and asked to provide details. So now 3/4 of people with COVID-19 are not being reached. How did the Prime Minister explain that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows very well, the test, track and trace operation is actually reaching huge numbers of people and causing them to self-isolate in ways I don't think he conceivably could have expected a month ago when this system was set up. It has now reached 113,000 contacts, 113,000 contacts who have undertaken to self-isolate to stop the disease spreading. And that is why we're now seeing the number of diseases, the number of new infections come down for several days running now to below 1,000. The number of deaths continues to come down. And that is a great achievement on the part of the entire population and their willingness to support test and trace.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister can't see that if 3/4 of those with COVID-19 are not being contacted and asked for their own contacts, that is a real gap in the system, and you can't just brush it away by referencing those that are contacted. It's a real problem and it's growing, and it's going to have to be addressed. The Prime Minister did this at phase 1, brushing away serious concerns. I want to turn to the Prime Minister's speech yesterday, if I may, Mr. Speaker. Amid the normal bluster, there was a really striking line in that speech. The Prime Minister said, "We know that the jobs many people had in January are not coming back." I fear that this is the equivalent line to the line in the Prime Minister's speech of March the 12th, when he said, "I must level with you. Many more families are going to lose loved ones before their time." And we know what happened next. That's why there needs to be a laser-like focus on protecting jobs. So how many jobs does the Prime Minister think yesterday's announcement will protect?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think he first of all might pay tribute to the work of this government in protecting 11 million jobs throughout this crisis. He might draw attention to the fact that we've supported huge sectors of the UK economy at a cost of £120 billion. And I'm not going to give a figure for the number of job losses that may or may not take place, but of course the risk is very, very serious, as he rightly says. But that is why we're proceeding with the new deal, the fair deal for the British people, which will be not just massive investment in our National Health Service, £34 billion in our NHS, £14 billion more into our schools, but an investment in infrastructure going up to £100 billion. That we are going to build, and deliver jobs for the people of this country.
Keir Starmer.
The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday was investment equivalent to less than £100 per person across the United Kingdom, 0.2% of GDP. Not much of his announcement was new, and it certainly wasn't much of a deal. Meanwhile, as the Prime Minister was speaking, Airbus announced 1,700 job losses, EasyJet 1,300 job losses, TM Lewin and Harvis 800 job losses. That's just yesterday. And there was nothing in the Prime Minister's speech for the 3.2 million people in hospitality or the 2.9 million in retail. Next week's financial statement could be the last chance to save millions of jobs. Will the Prime Minister start now by extending the furlough scheme for those parts of the economy that are still most at risk?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me just repeat and remind the House that overall this package represents a £600 billion package of investment in the UK economy. But the best single thing we can do is get our economy back to health by getting our people back into work and getting the virus defeated and under control. And the best thing actually that the opposition could do is stop equivocating and doing one thing one week and one thing another week this week, and decide that they emphatically support ending the lockdown. And they emphatically support kids being back in school rather than being bossed around by the unions. Mr. Speaker, we are the builders, they're the blockers, we're the doers, they're the ditherers. We're going to get on with it and take this country forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend not share my anger and the frustration of the Scottish tourist sector, just as it's getting back on its feet, that it's having the legs pulled out from under it by deeply irresponsible, damaging and divisive talk of arbitrary border closures and quarantining of visitors from across the rest of the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I find the suggestion absolutely astonishing and shameful. There will be no such discussions with the Scottish administration about that. But I would point out to my honourable friend what he knows very well. There is no such thing as a border between England and Scotland.
Talking of which, we come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that the thoughts of everyone in the House will be with me and those that were caught up in the terrible incidents in Glasgow last Friday, in particular with PC David White and those that went to do their duty, and we hope that everyone makes a speedy recovery from their injuries. Mr Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister delivered his self-proclaimed relaunch speech. But when asked what new money will be given to the Scottish Government at the daily press briefing, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson laughed. Laughed, Mr Speaker. That's what this government thinks about funding for the Scottish economy. Jobs, families and livelihoods. They think it's a joke. Is the Prime Minister capable of answering a direct question? And I don't want the usual waffle. It's a straightforward question. What are the new Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland as a result of yesterday's speech?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he probably does the spokesman in question a serious injustice, because I think I don't believe that he would have taken this issue anything other than seriously, because it's quite astonishing fact that already. Or he should wait till next week to have the full Barnett consequentials for what we're outlining from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor. But I really do hope that he and all his SNP colleagues go around brandishing the fact that not only has this crisis seen the British Army, the British Armed Services, absolutely indispensable in Scotland and elsewhere in helping us get through it, but they have seen the UK Treasury step up to the plate and get that furlough funding across all 4 parts of our United Kingdom. And it was a massive success. And let me tell him that already the Barnett consequentials amount to £3.8 billion for Scotland.
Going back to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Well, the Prime Minister simply couldn't answer the question, because the question was, what were the Barnett consequentials out of yesterday? And we know, Mr Speaker, that there was not a single penny for Scotland out of what was supposed to be a reset speech from the Prime Minister yesterday. This was a speech devoid of action, devoid of ambition, and devoid of any support for the most vulnerable in our society. The Prime Minister has set the UK on a 2-tiered recovery. On the same day that he delivered his speech, this Tory government reintroduced its benefit sanction regime after a 3-month freeze. That's not levelling up. It's heartless. It's cruel. It's unnecessary. Will the Prime Minister announce right now that he will keep the freeze on benefit sanctions, or will we have to wait till he's shamed into yet another U-turn?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beseech the right honourable gentleman, just to think that he may be mistaken. The UK government is absolutely dedicated to supporting people of all incomes across this country. That's why we've actually increased spending on benefits by £7 billion with universal credit, and we stand ready to do more. But I can tell him that there will be plenty of wonderful things that we want to do with him, working with the Scottish administration to improve transport and other infrastructure across the whole of the United Kingdom, including Scotland. So I really hope that he will cooperate.
We're now heading to Nikki Aitken. Nikki Aitken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency sits at the heart of our great metropolis. The cities of London and Westminster is the home of the West End, whose theatres and cultural venues such as the Royal Albert Hall, the London Palladium and the Barbican Centre attract visitors from across the globe and will help power our economic recovery. Does my right honourable friend share my aspiration to see these venues open as soon as it is safe to do so, ensuring that the show must go on?
Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the show must go on. I know the power of the theatres of London's West End, of the entire cultural industry in London, not just as a magnet for our country, but the sheer revenues they deliver. We want you going as fast as we possibly can, and we want to get life for theatres and for theatre goers to get back to normal as fast as we possibly can. But to do that, we have to defeat this disease, and that is what this government is engaged in.
Stephen Furry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 6 months from today exactly, the Northern Ireland Protocol sadly comes into operation. The government has already recognised that will involve checks and infrastructure with regard to regulation, which the Prime Minister knows is different from customs. So therefore, given that the business community is desperately seeking answers as to how the processes will work in detail, can the Prime Minister commit to providing that clarity before the end of this summer?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear from the existing text of the protocol that Northern Ireland is and remains a part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom, and there shall be unfettered access between all parts of the United Kingdom, and that's what we're going to ensure.
Jebson.
Mr. Speaker, what message might the Prime Minister have for the people of Hong Kong following the passage this week of China's new national security law?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We stand for rules and obligations, and we think that is the soundest basis for our international relations. And the enactment and imposition of this national security law constitutes a clear and serious breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It violates Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and is in direct conflict with Hong Kong basic law. The law also threatens the freedoms and rights protected by the Joint Declaration. We made clear, Mr. Speaker, that if China continued down this path, we would introduce a new route for those with British national overseas status to enter the UK, granting them limited leave to remain, with the ability to live and work in the UK and thereafter to apply for citizenship, and that is precisely what we will do now.
We're now heading to Belfast, so with Claire Hammer. Claire Hammer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, this morning and last week, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee heard from victims and survivors about the government's Troubles Legacy proposals, whether they were injured and bereaved by the IRA, by loyalist paramilitaries or by security forces. Those victims have rejected these proposals, which they say close the door on truth and justice. The proposals depart from those agreed by all parties, including the UK government, which had embedded the principle that all are equal before the law. Prime Minister, the statement of the 18th of March said that the proposal sought to put victims first and to build a broad consensus among victims. It's clear from our evidence sessions that these proposals can do neither. Will the Prime Minister please resile from the March statement and return to the principles embedded in the Stormont House Agreement and indeed in January's Stormont deal?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the victims have waited too long for these payments, and the way to unblock the progress is for the designation of a department to provide support for the Victims Payments Board. The Justice Minister has indicated that she's prepared to take on that role, and so the Executive must now move formally to designate and to prevent any further delay for victims.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, there are 3 million people in this country at the moment who get no support because they're self-employed or on contract. Our black, Asian and ethnic minority communities have an employment rate which is twice the national average, and women are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. The Prime Minister said a few minutes ago he stands ready to help. Will he look at a universal basic income so these people can get the help that they need now?
Well, she raises a very important point about the self-employed, though we have given very considerable support, as she knows, as part of the overall package of 120 billion to support, I think 22 billion altogether through the furloughing scheme for employed and self-employed people. But her further suggestion for a universal basic income is one that we have looked at, where the best way forward for our country is to get the disease under control in the way that we are doing, get our people back into work, build, and take this country forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was great to have my right honourable friend in the Black Country announcing his new vision yesterday, and perhaps next time he's in the Black Country, if he comes 5 minutes down the road to Tipton, we can sort him out a pint in the pie factory. Mr. Speaker, I was recently lobbied by 2 students in my constituency, Elliot Wilkes from Sandwell Academy and Will Gill from the Q3 Academy in Tipton, who want to know this. They want a reassurance from the Prime Minister that after years of neglect, years of being overlooked in our communities, in Wednesbury, Albury and Tipton, that after his announcement yesterday, we will finally get the the recognition for our communities that we deserve.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to stick off the pies at the moment, but we will. I can tell. You can tell his communities in Tipton. We are investing massively, not just in education, as I say, £14 billion more into our schools, but also in infrastructure that will reach every corner of the country, particularly the Midlands and the West Midlands. And I'm delighted that West Bromwich will receive at least £500,000 from the Stronger Towns Fund this year to support their high street and local community.
James David.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Met Arts Centre in my constituency is rightly proud of the work that it has done during lockdown, responding to the needs of young people and disability theatre groups in Bury. But its income has been decimated due to the fact that it is unable to stage events. Will the Prime Minister continue to do everything possible to support the cultural and creative sectors in Bury, Ramsbottom, Tottington and elsewhere to ensure that important community assets like the Met have a bright future going forward?
Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker, and I thank him for making the representations that he has. We will do everything we can to get all those sectors going as fast as we can and get life back as close to normal as possible for as many people as possible in this country. But the way to do that, Mr. Speaker, at the risk of repeating myself, is to continue to defeat the virus and take the country forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Enfield Southgate is home to Chicken Shed Theatre, an inclusive youth theatre company open for over 40 years, but it's now struggling financially. And despite the arts sector contributing over £5.2 billion each year to our economy, the government's failed to assist it as it hurtles towards the brink of collapse due to the coronavirus pandemic. So will the Prime Minister heed the calls from the Musicians' Union, BECTU and Equity and provide the financial support to ensure the survival of the arts sector?
Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, this is becoming quite a theme this morning, and quite rightly too. I'm a fan of Chicken Shed Theatre. I know their work. We will do everything we can to assist, and the economic case for doing so is overwhelming. I would just say to people, keep supporting your workers. With the furloughing scheme, it's much better now to wait for times to get better rather than laying people off. That's my message.
Heading to North Cumbria with Dr. Neil Hudson. Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Newton Rigg College is a land-based further education college in Penrith that has been listed for possible closure next year by its host institution. Will my right honourable friend ask government departments to work with me and local stakeholders to secure a sustainable future for this vital institution? And if we are successful, can I invite the Prime Minister to come to Penrith to see this fantastic college and the opportunities it provides to upskill, strengthen rural economies and support this government's levelling up agenda?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I know this will be a difficult time for the community and all those who care about Penrith College. Can I propose to him that he and I have a proper conversation about what we can do to help with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Education, and see if we can find an appropriate solution. But I thank him very much for the work that he's doing.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister doesn't want to talk about the numbers of job losses, so let me give him some. British Airways, 12,000 jobs potentially to go, including in the Vale of Glamorgan, in Llantrisant and in Blackwood. GE, 1,400 jobs potentially to go at Nantgarw. Rolls-Royce, 6,000 nearly to go in Derby, Solihull, Glasgow, Rotherham, and of course, as my right honourable friend has pointed out, Airbus, 1,700 jobs potentially to go in North Wales and in the South West, affecting my own constituents. Workers at those plants don't want to hear slogans, they don't want to hear bluff and bluster. They want to know from the Prime Minister what he is going to do to save those jobs in the long term. They've had the furlough scheme. What's he going to do to protect them going forward?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't wish to accuse the honourable gentleman of failing to listen to what I've been saying over the last few days. But in addition to the £120 billion of support that we've put into the economy, we have to recognise that people now are, as he says, worried about their jobs, and that is why we have a plan to build a £600 billion programme of investment and to deliver jobs. And for sectors across the country where we need to keep young people in particular in employment, we have offered, as he knows, Mr. Speaker, an opportunity guarantee so that they will have either an apprenticeship or an in-work placement or the opportunity for training.
Mr. Speaker, the pubs are reopening, but we still won't be able to go to the Marsden Jazz Festival, Slathwaite Philharmonic, Home Firth Picture Drome,
Rome, Lawrence Batley Theatre or even Honley Male Voice Choir concert? Will the Prime Minister, in an effort to support the thousands of musicians, actors, dancers across the country who are struggling, look at replenishing the Arts Council's funds that have been redirected to the emergency COVID response so that we can have a vibrant creative industries coming out of this crisis?
Mr. Speaker, the House is speaking with pretty much one voice this morning, and I totally share people's sense of urgency about wanting to get our wonderful creative culture, theatrical sector open as fast as we can. But the House will also remember that what we're trying to do now involves striking a balance. And it is very, very important as we open up the economy that we do not go too far and risk a second spike and risk further outbreaks. People can see what's happening in Leicester, for instance. We need to be very, very careful that we do this in a prudent way. And as we open the theatres, which we will, we want to make sure that we can do it in a COVID-compliant and COVID-secure way. And I'm sure that's what the House would want.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say it was excellent to see the Prime Minister participating yesterday in the Christians in Parliament event, and I thank him for the kind remarks that he made about answered prayer for his own health, and I wish him continued good health in the future. The Prime Minister said yesterday in a major speech that he wants the economy to build, and he announced that there was going to be 4,000 zero-emission buses for the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister ensure that those 4,000 new zero-emission buses are hydrogen buses that will produce jobs and deliver a new green economy for the whole of the United Kingdom? And will he invest in hydrogen?
Well, we'll certainly invest massively in hydrogen, Mr. Speaker. I can't make any particular undertakings about where those contracts will go now. But as he knows well, I'm a big fan of buses made in Ballymena.
Duncan Baker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the publication of MHCLG's report on the 8th of June into the risks of fraud and corruption in local government procurement, does the Prime Minister agree that procurement fraud betrays the taxpayer? It erodes public trust in our democratic systems, and we should take firm action against those that waste our public money?
Prime Minister.
I certainly do, Mr. Speaker, and I think that fraud is corrosive of public trust and wasteful of public money, and it is absolutely vital that all councils learn the lessons of that report, and I thank him for drawing it to the attention of the House.
Mr. Speaker, at Year 6, children on free school meals are 9 months behind their better-off classmates. By GCSE year, that extends to 18 months. 700,000 children have had no access to the internet for schoolwork during the lockdown. If the Prime Minister is sincere about wanting to level up and make this country good for everyone, will he give government time to pass a cross-party bill giving internet access and devices to all children on free school meals?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I passionately support the objective of making sure that there is IT fairness and all kids have access to the technology that they need. We've rolled out huge numbers of laptops across the country to kids to pupils on free school meals. But the most important thing that I think should happen now is that all pupils in Year 6 should now be back in school, and it's still very disappointing that we haven't had an unequivocal declaration of support for the safety of schools from the party opposite.
Rick Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Enterprise zone status at Silverstone Park and Westcott in my constituency has been critical in bringing high-tech innovators to Buckinghamshire across 5G, rocketry, automotive and motorsport. Will my right honourable friend join me in congratulating these wealth creators, innovators and entrepreneurs and commit to extending their enterprise zone status and business rate relief period from 2021 to 2024 to ensure they continue to be an engine of economic growth?
Prime Minister.
Well, I will certainly look at the proposal that he makes. I'm sure my right honourable friend the Chancellor will want to study it. But I also congratulate everybody involved with the Aylesbury Vale Enterprise Zone for the cutting-edge technology that exemplifies the very best of this country and shows the way to our future.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government was right to raise universal credit by £20 a week at the start of the crisis, but other benefits, like employment and support allowance, claimed by other people in identical circumstances, was not raised. The All-Party Working Pensions Select Committee recommended unanimously last week that those legacy benefits should be brought back into line with universal credit and raised. That's since been endorsed by the former Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Member for Preseli. Will the Prime Minister endorse it as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've done a huge amount, and he's a tireless campaigner on this matter, but I think the House will accept that we've done a huge amount to increase support for people on benefits, and I remind him that the increase in universal credit and working tax credit is up to £1,040 a year, benefiting 4 million families across this country.
William Bragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the state of us, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I will be among the first in these socially distanced queues as barbers and hairdressers reopen this weekend. But neither of us is likely to be queuing for an appointment at a beauty salon. Mr. Speaker, sadly, as much needed as it may be, sadly, neither will anybody else, as many of these much-loved businesses remain closed. Will the Prime Minister review this decision so that the likes of Lush Beauty and Romilly in my constituency can reopen safely as soon as possible?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that one day I will be going with him to Lush Beauty, it is a sad reality for many of these excellent businesses that they cannot yet open in the way that they want to, and I certainly share his sense of urgency, and I know that people feel it across the country, and they feel a sense of unfairness when they look at hairdressers opening, for instance. I just must repeat to the House the need to strike the balance that we've described, that I believe is understood by the party opposite, and the need also to open up in a way that is COVID secure. As soon as we can do that, as soon as we're sure, Mr. Speaker, that nail bars, that beauty salons can open in a way that are COVID secure, we will do so.
Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 17th of April 1984, I was a serving police officer in the Metropolitan Police when WPC Yvonne Fletcher was shot and killed whilst on duty policing a demonstration outside the Libyan embassy in London. No one has ever been charged in connection with her death. In light of reports at the weekend about a civil case being brought by her former colleague, PC John Murray, against one of the main suspects, will the Prime Minister pledge to reopen the criminal inquiry into the murder of WPC Yvonne Fletcher?
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable gentleman very much for his service in the police, and also to thank him for raising a very important subject that I've followed for many years, because the murder of WPC Yvonne Fletcher was sickening and cowardly. I think the best thing I can say to the honourable gentleman today is that I would welcome the opportunity to talk to him in person about the issue that he raises, to see what we can do to take the matter forward.
Scott Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for confirming the virus has proceeded far enough to open tourism in Cornwall next week? Will the Prime Minister join me in politely asking visitors to Cornwall to follow the example set by local people over the past 3 months and strictly respect distancing guidance? We want people to come and have a fantastic holiday in Cornwall. We just want them to be sensible when they're visiting.
Prime Minister.
I think, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend brilliantly sums up the approach that we want to take. We want our seaside communities, our fantastic national tourist areas, to feel confident about welcoming visitors this summer. We want loads of staycations. I think we're going to get loads of fantastic staycations, but we want people to observe the rules, Mr. Speaker, and to keep defeating the virus.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The way the disclosure and barring scheme is operating is damaging and discriminatory. But when I raised this with you last week, Prime Minister, I got the usual Home Office guff that they were considering the Supreme Court judgment. That Supreme Court judgment was in January of 2019, 18 months ago. The Lammy report highlighted this problem in 2017. So can we have no more dithering, Prime Minister? Will you sort out this scandal now?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I really do congratulate the honourable gentleman on returning so fast to the fray on this, and he's absolutely right. And I think the best thing I can do is write to him immediately, setting out what we propose to do, because I do think there are issues with the DBS scheme. I think every MP will have had representations from people who feel they've been unfairly treated by it. It does need looking at, and we should look at it urgently.
Final question from Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that the Education Secretary confirmed that he will set out this week the comprehensive plan to get every child back to school in September, which I know he strongly supports and which I do as well. Now, the Prime Minister is a great fan of buses. So can he confirm that that plan will also include the very significant number of children that depend on buses to get to school, so they can go back to school in September as well?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can certainly confirm that, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary for Education, has been working with the Department of Transport on that very matter.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. I call the Foreign Secretary to make a statement. Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I'd like to make a statement regarding the latest developments on Hong Kong. As I feared when I addressed the House on the 2nd of June, Yesterday, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress in Beijing adopted a wide-ranging national security law for Hong Kong. This is a grave and deeply disturbing step. We've carefully assessed the legislation, and in particular, we've considered its impact on the rights, freedoms, and critically, the high degree of autonomy bestowed on Hong Kong under China's basic law for Hong Kong, as well as under the Joint Declaration, which, as the House will know, is the treaty agreed between China and the UK in 1984. So, Mr. Speaker, today I have the depressing but necessary duty to report to the House that the enactment of this legislation imposed by the authorities in Beijing on the people of Hong Kong constitutes a clear and serious breach of the Joint Declaration. Let me explain to the House the grounds for this sobering conclusion. First, Mr. Speaker, the legislation violates the high degree of autonomy, executive and legislative powers, and independent judicial authority provided for in paragraph 3 of the Joint Declaration. The imposition of this legislation by the government in Beijing, rather than it being left to Hong Kong's own institutions, is also, it should be noted, in direct conflict with Article 23 of China's own basic law for Hong Kong, which affirms that Hong Kong should bring forward its own national security legislation. In fact, the basic law elaborates on this and only allows Beijing to directly impose laws in a very limited number of cases, such as for the purposes of defence, foreign affairs, or in exceptional circumstances in which the National People's Congress declares a state of war or a state of emergency. None of those exceptions apply here, nor has the National People's Congress sought to justify this law on any such ground. Second, Mr. Speaker, the national security legislation contains a slew of measures that directly threaten the freedoms and rights protected by the Joint Declaration. In this respect, the House will be particularly concerned by the potentially wide-ranging ability of the mainland authorities to take jurisdiction over certain cases without any independent oversight and to try those cases in Chinese courts. This measure violates paragraph 3, subparagraph 3 and 5 of the Joint Declaration and directly threatens the rights contained in the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which under the Joint Declaration are to be protected in Hong Kong. And I think in particular it's worth saying that those measures represent a flagrant assault on freedom of speech and freedom of peaceful protest for the people of Hong Kong. Third, Mr. Speaker, the legislation provides that Hong Kong's chief executive, rather than the Chief Justice, will appoint judges to hear national security cases, a move that clearly risks undermining the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary, again which is protected by paragraph 3, subparagraph 3 of the Joint Declaration. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, the legislation provides for the establishment by the Chinese government of a new Office for Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong, run by and reporting to the mainland authorities. That is particularly worrying, Mr. Speaker, because that office is given wide-ranging powers, directly intruding on the responsibility of the Hong Kong authorities to maintain public order, again directly in breach of the Joint Declaration, this time paragraph 3, subparagraph 11. Mr. Speaker, the authorities in Hong Kong have already started to enforce this legislation, with reports of arrests by the police and official notices warning the people of Hong Kong against waving flags or chanting. In sum, Mr. Speaker, this legislation has been enacted, as I said, in clear and serious breach of the Joint Declaration. China has broken its promise to the people of Hong Kong under its own laws. China has breached its international obligations to the United Kingdom under the Joint Declaration. And it's also worth saying, Mr. Speaker, that having committed to apply the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to the people of Hong Kong, China has now written into law wide-ranging exemptions which cannot credibly be reconciled with its international obligations or indeed its responsibilities as a leading member of the international community. Mr. Speaker, we want a positive relationship with China. We recognise its growth, its stature, and the powerful role it can play in the world. And I would say it is precisely because we respect China as a leading member of the international community that we expect the Chinese government to meet its international obligations, to live up to its international responsibilities. It has failed to do so with respect to Hong Kong by enacting legislation which violates its autonomy and threatens the strangulation of its freedoms. It is a sad day for the people of Hong Kong, and one which can only undermine international trust in the Chinese government's willingness to keep its word and live up to its promises. For our part, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the government are crystal clear. The United Kingdom will keep its word. We will live up to our responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong. And I can tell the House that after further detailed discussions with my right honourable friend the Home Secretary, I can now confirm we will proceed to honour our commitment to change the arrangements for those holding B&O status. And I can update honourable members that we have worked with ministers right across Whitehall, and we have now developed proposals for a bespoke immigration route for B&Os and their dependents. We will grant B&Os 5 years limited leave to remain with the right to work or study. After these 5 years, they'll be able to apply for settled status. And after a further 12 months with settled status, they will be able to apply for citizenship. This is a special, bespoke set of arrangements developed for the unique circumstances we faced and in light of our historic commitment to the people of Hong Kong. All of those with B&O status will be eligible, as will their family dependents who are usually resident in Hong Kong, and the Home Office will put in place a simple, streamlined application process, and I can reassure honourable members there will be no quotas on numbers. I want to pay tribute to the Home Secretary and her excellent team at the Home Office for their work and help in preparing, let's face it, for a moment that we all dearly hoped would not arrive. And the Home Secretary will set out further details of our approach in due course. Mr. Speaker, in addition to changing the arrangements for B&Os, the UK will continue to work with our international partners to consider what further action we should responsibly take next. And I can tell the House that yesterday in the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UK made a formal joint statement expressing our deep concern about the human rights situation in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Mr. Speaker, 26 other nations joined that statement, and this was the first time a formal statement has been made at the Human Rights Council on this issue, and it was delivered through our diplomatic leadership. We will continue to work with our partners in the G7, partners in the EU, and our partners across the region. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd say again that we want a positive relationship with China, but we will not look the other way when it comes to Hong Kong, and we will not duck our historic responsibilities to its people. We will continue to bring together our international partners, to stand up for the people of Hong Kong, to call out the violations of their freedoms, to hold China to its international obligations freely assumed under international law, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy.
Mr. Speaker, the new security law is deeply shocking, and the arrests overnight have stunned the world. This will have a chilling effect on democracy. It fundamentally undermines the commitments made by the Chinese government to the United Kingdom, and in turn the commitments that we made to the people of Hong Kong when we signed the joint declaration. I pressed the Foreign Secretary yesterday not to waver in his commitment to the people of Hong Kong, and I am grateful to him for coming to the House today to make this statement, for advance sight of it, and most of all to honour the promise that he made on the 2nd of June. He is right to do so, and he has our support. Can he tell us when the Home Secretary will provide details of the scheme for B&O passport holders and dependents, and has he made an assessment of likely take-up? Will salary thresholds apply? We are concerned that this must not become a scheme simply for wealthy Hong Kongers to abandon the city and leave others behind. Under the national security law, the government can extract money from those they believe to be involved in criminality or guilty of offences. In some cases, the people of Hong Kong will not be able to take sums of money out of the city. They could have their bank accounts frozen. So what recourse to public funds will apply, and will he ensure that dependents will be treated as home students for the purpose of tuition fees? Mr. Speaker, his commitment to B&O passport holders is welcome, but it does not resolve the problem. I was deeply moved to see the young activists who bravely took to the streets to protest against this law at considerable personal risk. The majority of them will not be covered by this scheme. They must not be abandoned. The loss of many highly skilled workers will be a blow to Hong Kong as well as to China. That is why we need additional measures. We've been waiting in this House for Magnitsky legislation for 2 years now. He must give us a date when that will be brought forward before the summer recess so that targeted sanctions can be applied to those who breach human rights in Hong Kong. Overnight, Mr. Speaker, pepper spray and water cannons were used against the pro-democracy protesters. It is now time for Britain to lead on an inquiry into police brutality. Can I welcome the cross-regional statement that our ambassador coordinated and place on record my thanks to him for his efforts? But will the Foreign Secretary now lead the charge for the appointment of a UN Special Rapporteur on Hong Kong? The provisions in the national security law that encourage people to confess and disclose others' so-called criminal behaviour have raised serious concerns about the prospect of torture. We must not turn away. What conversations has he had with Carrie Lam about the provision for the Chief Executive to handpick judges? And given the comments by the former Hong Kong Chief Justice Andrew Lee that this will fundamentally undermine the independence of the judiciary, what assessment has he made of the continuing role of British judges in the court system? Mr. Speaker, I wrote to him some time ago to ask him to address the direct challenge made by British companies like HSBC and Standard Chartered to the UK's stance by supporting this law. We cannot allow British businesses to become complicit in undermining the international rules-based order that they themselves rely on. Yesterday, he spoke up in defence of press freedom in this place. What discussions is he having with UK news agencies to defend their ability to continue to report freely on the situation on the ground, and with NGOs who will be deeply concerned that this law applies anywhere in the world? Mr. Speaker, the government has taken a step forward today with the announcement of new rights for BNO passport holders and a statement at the United Nations. But this is no substitute for ongoing and sustained international leadership. I urge him to bring forward a comprehensive, detailed and serious package of measures with international partners, as I have outlined. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the government must now develop a much more strategic approach to its engagement with the Chinese government. We support his view that a constructive relationship remains essential. But it is also clear that the UK needs far greater strategic independence in order to speak from and act from a position of values. Will he provide an updated assessment of the implications for national security of the involvement of Huawei in the 5G network? And will he make a similar assessment in relation to the planned nuclear projects involving CGN, Bradwell in particular? I remain deeply concerned, Mr. Speaker, that while this announcement is to be welcomed, his counterparts at the Treasury see Chinese investment as a central plank of the UK's recovery, and that the government's approach remains deeply confused. For too long in relation to China, we have had no strategy at home and no strategy abroad. I hope he can give us a commitment today that this marks the start of a very different era.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her support for the action that we're taking on Hong Kong and indeed the measures that we are introducing in relation to B&Os. She made a number of points and lamented the lack of a comprehensive strategy. I'd always be welcome to hear any particular suggestions she's got. I didn't hear any specific suggestions that weren't covered in my statement, but I'm happy to keep engaging with her. She asked about the details of the B&O offer. Of course, the Home Secretary will come forward and in due course, as appropriate, and set out all of those details before the House of Commons. Obviously, there will be all sorts of regulatory arrangements we need to put in place, but the contours of the offer are very clear. We welcome B&Os to come to this country. We say that we've got a specific historic responsibility to them, and there won't be any quota. We are in relation to her question about numbers, we of course constantly assess the likely take-up. I think in reality, a large number of those that might be eligible will want to stay in Hong Kong. Others may go to countries in the region, but we've got a historic responsibility and therefore we're making our position clear. And I've also had a number of conversations with our international partners, particularly those with with specific and close relationships with Hong Kong and who have large members of that community in their countries. And I would expect others to be looking very carefully at what they do. She asked about the Magnitsky legislation, said it was promised 2 years ago. It was in the manifesto in the 2019 election. I've been very clear we'll come to the House before recess, not just with the legislation, but the first designations. She also asked about Carrie Lam and representations that have been made to her. Andy Hain, our Consul General in Hong Kong, spoke to her in the last 24 hours to express our objections to the new legislation. The Foreign Office's Permanent Secretary will also summon the Chinese ambassador to reiterate the points that I've made before the House. I can tell the House that I spoke to Foreign Minister Wang Yi for a considerable period of time on the 8th of June, obviously trying to make clear in advance in order to try and avert this outcome our strong objections to the nature of the legislation. The Honourable Lady also mentioned extraterritoriality. It is a feature, she's right to note, in this legislation. It's not entirely clear how that will be applied in practice, but it is another sobering cause for concern, and I'm joining with her in expressing that. Finally, she asked about Huawei. She will know that the National Cybersecurity Centre are reviewing the situation in relation to Huawei and 5G in light of US sanctions and will report in due course, and I'm sure that the House will be updated as soon as that review is finalised and concluded. But above all, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say to her that it's an important moment across the House where we agree, frankly, on the strategic point that we all wish to make, which is that there has been a clear and serious violation of the Joint Declaration, that we must honour our obligations to BNOs, and also that we must work with our international partners to build the widest caucus and coalition of like-minded countries that say not just on the issue of Hong Kong, but also on the wider question of trust, that China must live up to its international responsibilities.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I first of all welcome the bipartisan nature of this discussion and the fact that both sides so clearly agree that this is a violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. May I also welcome hugely not only my right honourable friend who's here, but my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary's decision to open BNO status immigration rights. This is, as he will know, supported by about 2/3 of the UK people, according to a China Research Group poll which was published this morning. Can I also, however, state that the nature of extraterritoriality that he speaks about has direct implications on our own university sector and on freedom of speech within our own academic institutions, as Chinese students have already been influenced to silence debate and change outcomes here in the UK. Now, this also raises consideration about our own legal system, because as he knows, and as the Shadow Foreign Secretary raised, British judges sit in judgment in Hong Kong. How can they do that? How can they defend civil rights and commercial rights if they are being violated by the very law they are sent to uphold? Now, at the same time, we are watching this spread to other parts. We're already seeing Taiwan is under increasing pressure, as my right honourable friend, the former Foreign Secretary and former Health Secretary, pointed out a little while ago. The removal of the word peaceful for the bringing together of China that was spoken about by the time the Communist Party is 100 years old is a big change. And as one final point, would he join with me and the chairs of the select committees of Australia, Canada and New Zealand and call not just to make a statement at the UN Human Rights Council, but to ask that same council to send a special rapporteur to Hong Kong, because what happens in Hong Kong matters to the whole world.
Can I thank my honourable friend, Chair of the Select Committee, pay tribute to his assiduous work on this issue. He's right to pay tribute to the Home Office. They've done an excellent job with the Foreign Office in working through this issue. I think he's absolutely right to say that we shouldn't just be standing up for freedom of expression in Hong Kong, but also within British universities. I've raised this issue, discussed it with across government, including with the Education Secretary. I think it is something that we need to be very acutely aware of and make sure that we have every safeguard that we need in place. More generally, Mr. Speaker, I want to repeat, we will look out, and I pay heed to the various points that he made. I should also add, he's right to say that we need to work with the UN. I note the point he makes about the Special Envoy. I hope he would be, I think, reassured by the fact that we have delivered this unprecedented statement in the Human Rights Council with, in total, 27 international partners. It's not been done before. That is a testament to the leadership of the Foreign Office and our diplomatic network. We must continue to do it, because one of the things that we're increasingly seeing is China trying to not just on occasion violate international obligations, but undermine the rules-based international system. It is incredibly important that we work with our partners right around the world, obviously Five Eyes, European partners, to avoid that happening and to firm up the international rule of law.
We're heading and dropping in on Alan Smith, the SNP spokesperson in Stirling. Alan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'd also thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and as far as it goes, I agree with it also. The joint declaration was signed by Margaret Thatcher on the 19th of December 1984. A couple of years before that, the then Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, after the invasion unilaterally by Argentina of the Falkland Islands, resigned, describing the action as a humiliating affront. Now, the UK is a guarantor, not just a party to this agreement. The UK is a guarantor of the rights of Hong Kongers, a guarantor of one's party, two systems. And Beijing has ripped this treaty up in the Foreign Secretary's face, in full view of the international community. No amount of shiny new planes can disguise the fact that this is a humiliating affront, both for global Britain and for the Foreign Secretary personally. Now, on the substance of his statement, the one point of note about accelerating BNO passport holder status, I agree with that and I support that. But I would point out that when the West Berlin people were threatened by the USSR, the international community didn't offer them safe passage out. The international community worked a bit harder. And it's good that the European Parliament, at least, has been active in its defence of international law, passing just on last Friday a very strong motion urging that the EU should lodge an action in the International Court of Justice against China to hold it to account for its breach of international law. It is remarkable that the European Parliament and the European Union is rather more active in this than the UK has been. So on concrete points, will the Foreign Secretary commit to join this action in the International Court? And I welcome his words on the Magnitsky legislation, but it has been a long time coming. Will he now finally open active consideration of targeted sanctions against China and Chinese companies active within the UK? Because it's quite obvious only internationally concerted action will bring China to account, and it's quite clear they pay global Britain no heed whatsoever.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? It's always a pleasure to be lectured by the SNP on Margaret Thatcher. But we actually, amidst all the differences that we may have, I think agree on the fundamental points of principle at stake in relation to our commitment to BNOs and the people of Hong Kong. He said that the EU would be more active than the United Kingdom. It's just nonsense. But we do welcome the fact that the EU, which has different views amongst member states in relation to China and the specific issue of Hong Kong, are being more active. I was in Berlin recently to meet with my French and German opposite numbers, and one of the issues that we've worked together on, including within the G7, is making a clear position on Hong Kong as made. We will continue to work on that. It's incredibly important that it's not just a small minority of Western states making this point, because that is what China will seek to ignore, and that is why we've tried to expand as broadly as we can, as we did in the Human Rights Council just yesterday. I wasn't entirely clear what beyond proposals the government has already indicated it will take he is actually suggesting, but if he does in due course want to come back with something specific, I'd be very happy to consider it. In relation to Magnitsky, these were proposals of the Conservative Party in our manifesto, and just back in December we will be passing the relevant SI before summer recess with the first designations. I won't speculate or preempt what will be in those designations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada today has updated its Hong Kong travel advice to their citizens, stating you may be at increased risk of arbitrary detention on national security grounds and possible extradition to mainland China. Will the Foreign Office be changing our advice, and can he assure me that we, along with our international partners, will continue to speak out against this violation of Hong Kong's autonomy?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady and welcome all the work that she's done on human rights. I think she's right to draw attention to the specific issue of extraterritoriality. It's not clear, given the opaque way in which it's drafted in the national security legislation, how that is intended to be applied. We will take a very close look at it. We keep our travel advice under constant review, and I hope she's had the positive reassurance, given the statement made by 27 members in the UN Human Rights Council, that we are working actively, energetically with all of our international partners to be very clear that China must live up to its international obligations when it comes to the people of Hong Kong.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. The Foreign Secretary's statement will have been heard not just in this House, but in Beijing also. And I hope that in hearing that statement, they understand that the analysis that the Foreign Secretary has laid before the House today is not just the analysis of the government, but of this House as a whole. When you see reports of young Hong Kongers as young as 15 already being victims of this law, he must surely understand the importance of making sure that no Hong Konger is left behind in relation to the BNO passport arrangements. I very much share the disappointment and frustration of the Foreign Secretary that things have reached this point. But surely all countries and all institutions must understand that this is a moment where we have to pick a side. Either you can be on the side and stand with Hong Kong in the joint declaration, or else you choose to stand with the Chinese Communist Party. And in that regard, what will he do to urge the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation and also Standard Chartered Bank to reconsider the decision they took in relation to taking the sides?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his, I think, very judicious remarks. And I certainly welcome the substantive points he made. He talked about the importance of this House, not just the government, speaking with a united voice. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what we've had today on the key issue at stake, and I welcome his contribution to that. I also agree with him. It's heartbreaking to see the scenes in Hong Kong just hours after the enactment of this national security legislation. We are counselling the Hong Kong authorities and Beijing to step back, but it's clear, having enacted this legislation, that they wish to proceed. We will need to wait to see the precise application and enforcement of this action before deciding some of the measures that we might take next, but these are under active consideration, including with our international partners. I took the point he made about BNOs. The full details will be set before the House by the Home Secretary, but we're very clear with our commitment to provide a path for citizenship to all BNO, eligible BNO status holders, that we will do the right thing by all of them. Mr. Speaker, on HSBC and banks, I thank the honourable gentleman. I've been very clear in relation to HSBC, and I will say the same thing in relation to all of the banks. The rights and the freedoms and our responsibilities in this country to the people of Hong Kong should not be sacrificed on the altar of bankers' bonuses.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome every word of my right honourable friend's statement and the bipartisan nature of these exchanges? Can I invite my right honourable friend to take up the Honourable Lady for Wigan's appeal for a long-term strategic approach to China? What can we learn from the disastrous mistake of the government just a few years ago, who thought we were embarking on some new golden era with this dictatorship? Can I draw attention to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy's comments at the weekend, in which he said foreign policy making is often weakened by the lack of deep knowledge of the language, culture and history of the nations whom we seek to influence. Why has this been the case, and what can we learn from it? And how will the government now embark upon a big, comprehensive, sustainable strategic review on our relations with China, involving not just people within the government, but people beyond the government and other nations?
Can I thank my right honourable friend and the chairman of the Select Committee? He makes a range of important points. I would just say on Chinese expertise, I don't think the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster was referring to the Foreign Office. In any event, I can reassure him that we have some of the finest Mandarin-speaking diplomats around the world, and we are exceptionally well represented in Beijing by Her Majesty's Ambassador, Dame Barbara Woodward. We are increasingly across government looking at all aspects of our relationship with China. Obviously, the House is interested and will know about Huawei. The honourable gentleman referred, the chairman of the Select Committee, I think he's not in his place anymore, referred to the situation in universities. And he rightly raised the question, as did, in fairness, the Honourable Lady, about an integrated strategy. Clearly, as we bring forward the integrated review, China's role in the world and our relationship with China will be an absolutely essential element of that, and that's work that's already underway.
We're heading to Scotland to visit Dr. Philippa Whitford. Dr. Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. China's national security law completely undermines previous agreements on the status of Hong Kong and those who live there. It is a threat to judicial independence and freedom of the press, as well as political, civil, and human rights. With Huawei's ties to the Chinese state, instead of a long, tedious review of the 5G contract, will the government not take a stand now and cancel it?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I certainly share her views on our responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong and our concern about their treatment. In relation to Huawei, as I've already said to the House, given US sanctions, it is currently under review by the National Cyber Security Centre. We'll come forward with our response in due course.
Randall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning I read an English translation of this disgraceful law, and I see at Article 38 that it extends the law to any offences committed outside Hong Kong by non-Hong Kong residents. So further to my honourable friend's point, can my honourable friend press the point with China that UK visitors to Hong Kong and China will not be facing prosecution for acts that they may have said or done while in the UK?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We are concerned about that provision. It's not entirely clear how it would be applied. It has already been raised with Carrie Lam by the Consul General in recent over the last 24 hours. We will be expressing our concern, and of course that is something that the entire international community and tourists and visitors from all over the world will be concerned about, which is why it is so detrimental, not just to Hong Kong, not just to the international community, but also to China itself.
Heading to South Yorkshire to visit Sarah Champion. Sarah Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has benefited from Hong Kong for 155 years. We have a legal and moral duty towards them. It just can't be right that a Hong Konger protesting peacefully for rights that we bestowed on them 23 years ago could now end up in jail for life. I really welcome what the Foreign Secretary has said about BNO passport holders, but can he speak a little about what he would do for the human rights of all Hong Kongers in Hong Kong, not least because last year his department funded China £500,000 from foreign aid, specifically on human rights?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady, Chair of the Select Committee, and share with her concern about what's going on in Hong Kong, but also welcome her support for the position the government's taken, and she joins members from all sides of this House in doing so. We're obviously deeply concerned about all aspects of this national security legislation, and we'll do everything we can to encourage the Chinese government to think again. I think we need to be realistic about it. In relation to BNOs, clearly, as you will know, there are close to 3 million eligible BNOs and over 300,000. I think the offer we've made is right, given the responsibilities that we've made. Clearly, we're concerned more broadly about the residents of Hong Kong, and that's a conversation that we rightly are having with our wider international partners.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement and the decisive action being taken. Unfortunately, this follows a catalogue of actions being taken by the Chinese government to undermine international law. So could he confirm, when the Chinese ambassador is summoned to the Foreign Office, we'll be bringing up not just this awful legislation, but also that catalogue of actions, and making clear to the Chinese government that it can no longer be business as usual?
Here, here.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? And he's absolutely right that we will raise our concerns in relation to the national security legislation right across the board. The Permanent Secretary will do that with the Ambassador. Our Consul General has done it with the Chief Executive. I had close to an hour with Wang Yi, the Foreign Minister. I think it was the 8th of June, as I previously said to the House. And of course, we talk about the full range of our relationship. We want a positive relationship with China. There are all sorts of opportunities there in relation not just to trade, but also climate change and COP26 coming up. But what we cannot do, whether it's in relation to our national security or our values, is look the other way just because of its asymmetric power, think that we have to kowtow or have to duck or bow. We will not do that. We will not do that on the issue of Hong Kong, and we will not do that wherever else our vital interests are at stake.
Let us go and visit Geraint Davis in Swansea West. Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, as the Foreign Secretary knows, the European Parliament decided to call for the Magnitsky Sanctions on officials who abuse human rights to be applied, to call for China to be brought before the International Court of Justice, and for the United Nations envoy to Hong Kong. Will he now take the lead in these issues, bringing with us European nations, Asian and the United States? Or is he content to sit on the sidelines when we have a special interest in championing the democracy, the human rights and the rule of law in Hong Kong?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? I think he's a bit confused. The European Parliament doesn't have, and the EU doesn't have, an autonomous human rights sanctions regime. The United Kingdom will do by summer recess with our first designations. We would certainly, and we're engaged in the conversation with our European partners. The honourable gentleman is shaking his head. He's just not right about that. But we are engaged with our European colleagues to encourage them to follow suit and take this step. He raised a range of other issues, which we were, of course, very happy to look at. But I would just draw his attention to the statement in the United Nations Human Rights Council, an unprecedented statement with 27 states signing up to make clear our concerns in relation to human rights on Hong Kong, but also on Xinjiang.
Mr. Speaker, can I salute the outstanding leadership being shown by my right honourable friend on this issue, and indeed the superb leadership being shown by Dame Barbara Woodward as our ambassador in Beijing, one of our most difficult posts, and we are truly lucky to be led by a diplomat of such calibre there. The basic difference is that we believe that freedom of expression and peaceful protest supports social stability, whereas the Chinese government thinks it undermines social stability. When you look at what's happening in the rest of the world, it has never been more important to stand up for those values. So could my right honourable friend tell the House what other steps the Foreign Office is taking to support freedom of expression and media freedom across the world?
Secretary. Can I thank my right honourable friend and pay tribute to his work on the issue of media freedoms, but also in relation to China and Hong Kong. This has been a long time coming, and we've tried to prepare for the best, but we've hoped for the best, but we've been prepared for the worst. He's right to pay tribute to Dame Barbara. It is a difficult posting. She's performed exceptionally well. And he asked in particular about media freedoms. He will know that, because it was established under his tenure rather than mine, that we have a media freedom campaign which we lead along with the Canadians. We are swelling the ranks of that. It deals with support for countries that want to protect media freedoms, but it also provides support for journalists. We have also a campaign to protect freedom of religious belief, and the third element of this will be the Magnitsky Sanctions regime, which I'll bring before the House with the first designations before the summer recess.
Heading to Scotland again with Margaret Furry. Margaret Furry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Foreign Secretary tell the House what discussions the Foreign Office has had with NGOs operating in Hong Kong who will likely be targeted as a result of this new national security law?
I thank the Honourable Lady. Look, we obviously have contacts with civil society on the ground through our missions and posts, but also through direct contracts here in London. They are deeply concerned, and they fear that they will be subject to this law, and they will bear the brunt of this law in the harshest terms conceivable. We are deeply concerned for them, which is why we've taken the action we are.
Now comes the gallant member for Beckenham, Bob Stewart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I served in Hong Kong as an army officer. But the great thing about Hong Kong is it's got one foot in China and another foot in the West. And when you're looking at financial services, that is a huge advantage to the people of Hong Kong. Now we have a situation where this law will put this position where many people will consider withdrawing money out of the Hong Kong money markets and the financial services there, possibly to Tokyo or Singapore, or maybe to Shanghai. I wonder if this is also a little gambit
by the Chinese authorities to reduce the money-making influence of Hong Kong in the world?
Can I thank my honourable friend? The reality is, he's right that Hong Kong has long been regarded as the jewel in the financial crown. Of course, its relative economic importance has ebbed over time as China has economically developed. But the reality is that the steps that have been taken are clearly counterproductive by China's own self-interest in economic terms. And what we are clearly seeing is China put the political imperative to control Hong Kong and other so-called restive provinces of China over the economic interest that it has. In any event, frankly, regardless of the financial circumstances, there is a point of principle at stake here, based on their freedoms, their autonomy, and the commitments under international law that China has signed up to. It must, if it wants to be a leading member of the international community, live up to the international responsibilities, the international obligations that it undertakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That action is announced for BNO passport holders is welcome, but actually does nothing to bring China to boot. The reality is global Britain is so weak regards China because it's reliant on CGN for nuclear, it's reliant on Huawei for 5G. If he wants to prove me wrong, will he rule out any future deals with CGN for nuclear power stations?
I say to the honourable gentleman that the open investment culture that we have in this country constantly needs to be kept under review. We've seen it with Huawei, and of course we'll look at it in other areas. But the reality is it is also a source of this country's strength. So I do not accept for a second his suggestion that Britain, being an open and outward-looking country welcoming investment, is somehow the reason for what's happened in Hong Kong. And he shouldn't let China off the hook. It is China's, and he said from a sedentary position, Brexit. I mean, it's ludicrous to blame what's happening in Hong Kong on Brexit. The honourable gentleman should not let China off the hook. It is China's failure to live up to its responsibilities that is at fault here and is at stake here. And it's important that we've got unanimity across this House on this critical point. Otherwise, the truth is, we just weaken our message in Beijing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I also add my welcome to the Foreign Secretary's statement and his decisive action, and to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Right Honourable Member for Wigan, and I fully endorse her idea of a UN Special Rapporteur as a way forward in tackling with Hong Kong, because the people of Stoke-on-Trent, Kidsgrove and Torquay were shocked by the actions of China upon our friends in Hong Kong. And so I would like to ask, does my Right Honourable friend agree that now is not the time to allow the Chinese government-funded Huawei to have access to our mobile networks, and instead we should be backing local and regional solutions here at home, such as the Staffordshire 5G connected growth deal?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take many of the points he makes. I share the concern of his constituents. I think the issue we've got in 5G is, frankly, a longer-term issue where we have failed to provide the diversification of supply, which allows us to rely on high-trust vendors rather than high-risk vendors. That matter is now, as he knows, in light of US sanctions, currently under further review by the National Centre for Cyber Security, and we'll come to the House when that's thoroughly been looked at.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I saw reports this morning that the prominent young activist Joshua Wong is now removing himself from politics, taking a step back. What assurances can the Secretary of State give us that this government will be doing everything it can to protect young activists in Hong Kong like Joshua from being arrested and disappearing?
And I thank the Honourable Lady. It is very sad to see his movement be disbanded for fear of the consequences. I share her concern about that, and I welcome her support. We've obviously taken the step on BNO because that gives us the opportunity to provide sanctuary to those that feel that they cannot stay in Hong Kong. Many will choose to stay, and we will work with our international partners to convey as effectively as we possibly can to China and consider all the potential actions that we might take next.
Dr. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for both the content and the tone of the statement today, because it's a cause of great sadness that we have just witnessed the death of one country, two systems, with all the implications that that will have internationally, something that will be shared across the IPAC countries. Hong Kong is still the entry point for much of China's inward investment. Has my right honourable friend had the chance to assess what the disregard for international treaty law that we've seen today will have for the security of international investments in Hong Kong, which are still so necessary for the social stability and prosperity of the Chinese people?
Can I thank my right honourable friend and agree entirely with his sentiments as well as the specific points he made. And of course, I think as well as the people of Hong Kong, but investors and other people who might wish to visit Hong Kong and who ordinarily would have done will be looking very carefully, not least given the extraterritorial elements of this law, as to what it will mean. At the very least, above all the points that have been made in the chamber today, it will risk a further range of uncertainty for businesses and for finance into Hong Kong. And as I said, that must be counterproductive, not just for the people of Hong Kong, not just for those investors, but for China itself.
Heading up to Yorkshire with Boris Sherman. Boris Sherman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I recall my first visit to Hong Kong to the Secretary of State when I was part of the parliamentary delegation, to our shame, that went to Hong Kong and assured the Hong Kong people that the Chinese would stick to the agreement. I'm very angry about this morning, but could I remind him, what I've learned about China over the years, it is a ruthless communist dictatorship. It despises and hates democracy, and it is worldwide busy undermining these democracies. And like all dictatorships, it cannot be appeased. And if we don't take action in trade, in investment, and really hit them where it hurts, we will not be able to stop this tiger growing more and more ferocious.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I agree with him on the concerns he's expressed? I don't think he should feel personally bad about the commitments he made. We all shared that hope that China would live up to those responsibilities. What we're making clear is that even if China fails to live up to its responsibilities, we, one United Kingdom, including the Honourable Gentleman, will live up to our responsibilities to those B&O passport holders. I take his point about the wider threat from China. Of course, given its size, its economic asymmetry, I think we need to think very carefully with all of our international partners how we proceed. We do not want to have a poor relationship with China. We want a positive relationship with China. One thing is clear, though, we will not duck issues like human rights or our values or issues that touch on our vital national interests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Chair of the Select Committee referred to earlier, a recent poll by the China Research Group expressed strong support for extending the rights of B&O passport holders to come to the UK, and I welcome his statement with that regard. They also expressed very strong support for sanctions. 80% of the people who expressed a preference felt there should be travel bans and asset freezes for Chinese officials who are responsible for this legislation. Is that something that's under consideration?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the points he's made. It is right that the public support this, and on the scale that the public support given the issue, I think it is remarkable, a tribute to the open-heartedness of the British people and the sense of history and responsibility. He raised a range of other issues, clearly trying to tempt me down, giving him a foresight into what may be in the Magnitsky legislation, which is coming. He'll have to wait a little longer, but it will come before summer recess.
We're now heading up to Scotland. Let's go with Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already seen dozens of individuals arrested since the passing of the law, many if not all of whom solely for their political opinions. Is the government aware of any BNO passport holders having been arrested? If so, how many have been? And has it made specific representations to the Chinese authorities on their behalf, given that many of them could face life in prison simply for their opinions?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman? I don't have a detailed breakdown of how many either BNO passport holders or BNO status holders have been arrested at this point in time. Of course, the legislation has only been in place for a day, but we have made representations more generally on the national security legislation. And of course, one of the features, even before the changes that we make, of BNO passport holders is that we can exercise consular protection on their behalf in third countries. But I think the most important thing at this stage is to proceed with the changes that we've made and to be very clear that the United Kingdom will be able to offer sanctuary through by means of a route to citizenship in this country.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I very much welcome what my right honourable friend has said about the Magnitsky proposals upon which he and I worked together in the past, and also very much welcome what he said about the new rights for BNOs. In dealing with China, we should always champion our values and never trim on that. But will he make clear to the Chinese regime, and will he reinforce with them, that wherever possible, we seek cooperation and not confrontation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend? He's absolutely right, and he has long-standing experience, of course, when he was Deputy Secretary of State on the relationship with China. It is double-edged. There are opportunities as well as risks, not just on trade, but in climate change, which he will have known given the strong development angle. I think he's absolutely right to say that we want a positive relationship. We do not want it to deteriorate or to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're very clear in our approach to China on this, but equally when it comes to issues of values, human rights, and international obligations which go to trust and confidence, not just in the United Kingdom having trust and confidence in China, but in the world and the international community having trust and confidence in China. China must live up to its word. China must keep its international obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The offer to BNO passport holders and to those eligible is the right, decent and thoroughly British thing to do. But those people and the Chinese government must be convinced that this offer is not theoretical, it is absolutely real. So I wonder if the Foreign Secretary would set out practical steps that he will take to make sure that those who arrive in the UK are welcomed in our society and in our wider communities.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman and the right honourable gentleman and say that I totally agree with the sentiments. It's all very well to put the processes in place. I've set out the framework for it. But we need to be very clear that we will embrace any BNOs that come to this country. We understand the ordeal that they've been through, and frankly, the Chinese and the Hong Kong residents that live in this country make an incredible contribution already. And I know that any that come as a result of these changes will continue to do so.
Speaker. Can I join with others in strongly welcoming the decisive action of the Foreign Secretary today in creating a bespoke route to citizenship of those people from Hong Kong for the BNOs and their dependents? But will the Secretary of State reassure me that he will continue to take our unique responsibility to those in Hong Kong deeply seriously, and that he will continue to stand on the side of all of those who are seeking democracy and freedom?
Hear, hear. Can I thank my honourable friend? I absolutely share. I absolutely agree with the point she's made. As I said, not just taking this up with the authorities in Hong Kong, but also with China. I spoke to Wang Yi on the 8th of June for a considerable period of time, and we raised this in the Human Rights Council. More generally, the three pillars of our approach to media freedoms and freedom more generally are media freedoms that we're taking forward in leadership with Canada, the freedom of religious belief, which has now an international caucus that we're trying to swell the ranks of actively, and the Magnitsky legislation, which is the third pillar, and where we will be bringing forward the legislation before the summer recess.
Let's go and visit Dave Dugan in Angus. Dave Dugan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We heard yesterday from the Minister for the Middle East and North Africa that the UK government has made it clear to Israel that they oppose annexation and the UK regards it as a contrary to international law. Yet the Israeli government pays no heed to the UK in this matter. So how does the UK government intend to be less ineffectual in its protest with the Chinese government over Hong Kong? And can the Home Secretary confirm what steps will the UK take with international partners to coordinate an international and collective response to this indisputable and flagrant breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration?
Honourable gentleman, I didn't hear a specific proposal of what he would like us to do that we're not doing, but can I just say to him that in addition to all of the things that we're doing that I've set out before this House, we are actively working with our international partners. He will, if he looks, he will have seen that in the G7 Foreign Minister's statement that we've previously put out, in the Five Eyes statement that we put out when the decision was taken to proceed to enact the law, and in the statement made in the UN Human Rights Council by 27 different states proposed and led by the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, what has happened to the people of Hong Kong is chilling. In one sinister moment, their rights and freedoms have been swept away. These are rights and freedoms that perhaps here we take for granted too often, but which we must defend to the hilt. So will my right honourable friend reassure the people of Hong Kong that it is not only the British Parliament that stands alongside them, but the British people who stand alongside them? And will he therefore make it very clear that Britain will do whatever it takes to make the Chinese understand they cannot behave in this way without consequences?
Secretary.
Honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. It feels to me that from the various interventions and the points that have been made in relation to the polling that's been done on this, that we send out today a very clear message to the people of Hong Kong. We stand with you as a government, as a house and as a country.
And returning to Scotland with Owen Thompson. Owen Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, anyone who cares about freedom of speech must be gravely concerned about the criminalising of dissent that this security law represents, and concerns are also heightened by growing evidence of the appalling atrocities being committed by the Chinese regime against the Uyghur population. Does the Secretary of State agree that now is the time for an independent investigation and to support the creation of a UN Special Envoy or Rapporteur for Hong Kong and also the people of Xinjiang, who will have a special responsibility for monitoring the human rights situation on the ground?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? I certainly share his sentiments, and he will have seen that the statement that I referred to various times in relation to Human Rights Council over the last 24 hours was in relation to Hong Kong and Xinjiang. I think he needs to be, if I may say so, realistic about the likelihood of China ever accepting a rapporteur or an international investigation being allowed into that area to monitor the facts and the situation on the ground in the way he describes. But that shouldn't deter us for a moment from keeping the international pressure up, and I welcome his statement in that regard.
Fielder Bruce.
Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his strong leadership on this issue and his very clear focus on human rights, which is, if I may say, after some years of expressing concerns about this as chair of the Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, welcomely refreshing. Can I ask, is he aware that over 50 UN Special Rapporteurs have this week called for a Special Rapporteur or Envoy on Hong Kong? Would he respond to the many calls within this chamber for the UK to take a lead on that in the Human Rights Council?
I thank my honourable friend and pay tribute to her work in promoting freedom of religious belief all around the world. We've worked in the United Nations. We've raised the issue in the United Nations Security Council as well as in the Human Rights Council. We'll do everything we can, and I'm very open to the idea of a UN Special Envoy. I think we need to be realistic about what that alone might achieve, but I think as part of a wider approach which keeps every lever of pressure available on the Chinese government to think again, I think it's something important that we should look at.
29 withdrawn, so we'll go to Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement today and very much thank him and the Home Secretary for their action on BNO. This action by the Chinese government has been roundly condemned. Does the Foreign Secretary share my view that this is the time for all countries who are committed to peace, freedom and democracy to come together and make clear to the Chinese government that this action is likely to prove counterproductive in the advancements of their own international interests?
I thank my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. And one of the challenges we've got as China exerts all of its economic and diplomatic leverage to sway those to either support it or to stay quiet on these issues is to make sure that people understand and other countries understand quite what is at stake, which is why in the way I framed this, it's important not just to talk about the human rights, the autonomy of the people of Hong Kong, but this quintessential issue of trust. Trust in China's ability to keep its word when it has freely given it, as it did through the joint declaration.
Newlands.
Mr. Speaker, John Major said before the handover, if there were any suggestion of a breach of the joint declaration, we would have a duty to pursue every legal and other avenue available to us. So can the Secretary of State tell the House what avenues the government is pursuing to respond to the national security law which dismantles the one country, two systems law? And will it consider lodging a case as a signatory to the signing of British declaration to the International Court of Justice?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? And he's not the first person to raise this issue of the ICJ, but as honourable members may or may not know, you cannot submit a case to the court unless it's under the compulsory jurisdiction of the court without the consent of the other side. It's very clear that China would not accept it. I did raise the issue of third-party adjudication with my Chinese opposite number. It's very clear that they will not accept that. So there is not an easy adjudicative route, but I hopefully give him the reassurance that we have already looked at that very carefully.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his statement and for his clear leadership, and even his leadership in the UN, and particularly on the Magnitsky arrangements that he intends to bring forward. Can I, however, remind him and others that for China, they think that Hong Kong is collateral damage that they can happily sweep to one side. The truth is they see themselves in an ideological battle about how government should be formed, and they dismiss the rules-based order of the West. They've made that very clear, and they have a strategic view on this. So does he not agree with me? It's time, therefore, for us to bring the free world together, to say to them not just to complain, not just to get rapporteurs, but also to say it's time to hit them in the one place that China worries about, which is its economy. We have run to China to buy goods and to invest. It's time for us now to review every single programme here in the UK and around the free world. We learnt a lesson 80 years ago about appeasement of dictators. Maybe that should be applied today.
Can I thank my right honourable friend and grateful for his generous remarks. He's absolutely right to point to the importance of shoring up the values that we hold dear, the values reflected in the United Nations in the multilateral system. And I think it is right to say that what is at threat here is not just individual obligations in relation to the people of Hong Kong, but a wider question of China trying to recraft the rules of the international system. And it will only take concerted effort with our international allies, Europe, North America, but actually much more broadly than that, which is why the G7 statement in support on Hong Kong was so important, to make sure that we can shore up the multilateral system and the international rule of law.
Jim Shannon. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also thank the Secretary of State for his statement. I fully understand and appreciate his deep concerns. The Minister is well aware of the Chinese systematic suppression of religious beliefs and human rights towards communities such as the Christians, the Uyghur Muslims and Falun Gong. Indeed, just this week here, China has initiated the sterilisation of Uyghur mothers to prevent them having children. Does the Minister share my concern that this will allow these abuses to take place in Hong Kong, and how can we prevent this from happening?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I share entirely his outrage, frankly, at the reports that we've seen and what's happening in Xinjiang and indeed in Hong Kong. The reality is, given China's economic size and indeed its military size, is that what we've got to do is focus, as my right honourable friend mentioned, on swelling the international caucus of like-minded countries who understand what is at stake here. It's not just the issue of Hong Kong, as important as that is, but it's the rules-based international system and the values represented within it.
Dr. James Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that if China is to be treated as a leading member of the international community, it must adhere to international law?
Can I thank my honourable friend? It's exactly the issue at stake here. We recognise China's economic strength, potential growth, and also the opportunities for China to be a force for good in the world on things like climate change. But with that status, that role as a P5 member of the Security Council, it must show leadership, and that means living up to its international responsibilities, and that means adhering to the international commitments it made, in particular in relation to the Joint Declaration.
I'll go to Lewisham, to Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been contacted by a number of constituents who are worried about the safety of loved ones in Hong Kong. What guidance is the UK Foreign Office offering to British nationals living overseas in Hong Kong? And when does the Foreign Secretary expect the BNO passport holder visa rights extension to be implemented? Now, more than ever, the UK must fulfil its commitment to the people of Hong Kong.
I thank the Honourable Lady and say that the full details will be presented by the Home Secretary in due course. We've set out the parameters of the offer, the bespoke offer that we're making to the B&Os in relation to any of her constituents in Hong Kong or family members that may be worried. I would urge her to look at the Foreign Office travel advice, which we keep constantly under review.
We now go to Bexley Heath to Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I strongly support and welcome my Right Honourable Friend's statement today. This is really a sad day for Hong Kong and all of its people. Does my Right Honourable Friend agree that the new national security law, of course, is hugely detrimental to the people of Hong Kong, but will also do great damage to China and its reputation? We must therefore continue to be robust in our responses on behalf of the people of Hong Kong, as he has outlined.
Can I thank my honourable friend and just say that I totally agree with him. It is a deeply sorrowful day when we look back at the opportunity, the potential, the success of the vibrant community, business and social in Hong Kong, to see it come to this. He's right that it should inspire us to redouble our efforts to work with the international community to try and safeguard the rights of the people of Hong Kong, and in any event to make sure that they can come to the United Kingdom through the new offer that we're making to B&O passport holders.
And now we go to Glenrothes, Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While it's clearly tempting to look at the potential financial benefits of increased trade and investment with China, as the Honourable Member for Strangford reminded us a few minutes ago, this is a regime that is committing acts of brutal violence against its own people, including credible accusations of genocide against its own citizens. Does the Foreign Secretary accept that the desire to increase the profits of British businesses and to increase the wealth of British citizens cannot be allowed to overcome our revulsion at the evils being committed on our fellow human beings by the Chinese regime right now?
Share that sentiment, and that's exactly the policy and the measures that we've set out in the statement I've made today.
Now we go to the Isle of Wight, to Bob Seeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary and the Home Secretary for their very welcome support for B&Os. Would the Foreign Secretary agree that this dreadful law is proof that China has changed? And I hope he sees the clear agreement in the House that we need a new strategic approach to this communist dictatorship, and not just a naive hope that China will change into what we want it to be. We were slow to prepare for the new authoritarianism in Russia and now China. Will he take the feelings and the sentiment that he's heard today from the House on Huawei, on other issues, on board? Thank you.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? I certainly always pay very close interest to the remarks he makes on China. He follows it very closely. He's right, we've got special responsibilities to the B&Os. We look at the relationship right across the board, every aspect of it, through the National Security Council, in the Foreign Office, and more broadly across Whitehall. I personally do not agree with the Cold War analogy that he has provided. I think both the opportunities but also the challenges that China presents in the 21st century are different. They're different partly as a result of technology and things like cyber, and partly just the unique nature of China as a country. We want a positive relationship. I do not want, and the government does not want, a bad relationship to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what is equally clear, and I can reassure the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is that we will not do anything that imperils our vital interests, and we will not lie down and sacrifice our values for the purposes of trade, commerce, or anything like that.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I also welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement, and indeed the thoughtful manner in which he is responding to questions this afternoon. It is a very British characteristic to make the Hong Kongers welcome when they come to the UK. Part of the welcome will be adequate housing, adequate health services, and all sorts of other issues that are devolved to the devolved administrations. Can I seek reassurance from the Foreign Secretary that Her Majesty's Government will consult and discuss fully with the devolved administrations how these Hong Kongers can be given the best welcome possible?
Foreign Secretary.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman. I totally agree with him. We obviously need to consult with the DAs on any significant measure like this which comes into force. We will do that. I know the Home Secretary will do that. I also think one of the things that will give a fillip to the people of Hong Kong in a very dark day will be the statements of support right across this House from all parties that we stand with them. And they will know when they come here, if they come here, when they come here, that we support them, we value them, and that we understand the plight that they're fleeing.
And finally, Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. As we have heard, the first arrests have already been made under Beijing's sweeping new powers for offences all of us here consider to be basic freedoms. Those arrested face life imprisonment, sham trials, no jury and an executive-appointed illegitimate judiciary. I thank my right honourable friend for all the work he has done. I ask for his assurance that he will continue to keep us updated here about what he's doing at the Human Rights Council and about false imprisonments and the poor sentences and the numbers of arrests so we can really lead the international way in this field.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will certainly update the House as regularly and as consistently as we can, based on the data that we can reliably glean from what's going on the ground in Hong Kong. Our Consul General, as well as Her Majesty's Ambassador in Beijing, our Consul General in Hong Kong, is doing an exceptional job, quite difficult circumstances. The number one thing, though, is that we will need to work with our international partners to try and alleviate the situation as best we can. And that is why, that come what may, we need to make this direct, clear, unequivocal offer to the BNOs, which is what we're doing today.
Thank you. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next item of business, I suspend the House for 3 minutes. Order. The House is now resumed. Point of order, Mr. David Davis.
Deputy Speaker, later today we're doing the last stage of the finance bill, and historically the first resolution for a finance bill has been what is known as a general amendment of the law resolution. This resolution gives cover for members to table amendments that deal with tax administration and relief provisions not otherwise authorised by the specific ways and means resolutions. Former Chancellor Philip Hammond chose not to include such an amendment in the November 2017 finance bill. Bluntly, this was a pretty grubby trick at the time, and I'm afraid his successors in the Treasury have failed to include such an amendment ever since. In effect, by not including an amendment of the law resolution, the government has shut down the rights the House has enjoyed for many centuries. Members' voices must be heard on these important matters of taxation. The government cannot continue to abuse its powers to curtail the rights of the House the way it has. The House must have an opportunity to put this right. Therefore, my question to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, is can the House authorities look to address this issue and ensure members can properly fulfil their roles and be free to amend future finance bills as they see fit? I will also be raising this matter with the Procedure Committee.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his point of order and for having given notice of it. He is absolutely right in his analysis, but in fact there is nothing disorderly in the lack of an amendment of the law resolution among the budget resolutions. Had it been disorderly, it would not have been allowed. It was allowed, it is not disorderly, but he is correct that the actions that have been taken do limit the scope for amending the finance bill. He asks me if the House authorities will look into this. I think that he has actually found for himself the correct solution in asking the Procedure Committee to look at this, and I'm quite sure that the chairman of the Procedure Committee will have been made aware of the Right Honourable Gentleman's very realistic concerns and that they will take the matter forward. I certainly hope so. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Pete Wishart.
And thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to ensure that the nomination of a Prime Minister and the appointment of his or her Cabinet be a matter for this House. And this is the third time, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've attempted to bring this bill forward to the House. First time it had to be withdrawn because of a general election. The second time because of the COVID lockdown. So I was trying today, Madam Deputy Speaker, to ensure that no other disaster was to befall me so that I could be here in my place to deliver this bill. One of the most curious things about the whole concept of parliamentary sovereignty is the fact that this House is not in the least bit sovereign in the nomination of a Prime Minister. Shrouded in semi-mysticism and quasi-convention, this House plays absolutely no part in the process of deciding or determining the nomination of Prime Minister, save serving solely as a mere spectator. So what my bill does is to put that right, by ensuring that the nomination of a Prime Minister and his or her Cabinet is a matter for this House, and ensure that we, as representatives of the people of this country, have a role to play in handing over the keys to the most powerful office and offices in this land. Firstly, what it's not. This bill would not in the least alter the role of Her Majesty the Queen in the proceedings at all. The appointment of a Prime Minister will still be exclusively the job of Her Majesty the Queen as part of her prerogative powers. But what this bill actually does is to strengthen the constitutional convention of keeping the monarch out of politics by ensuring that she would appoint a Prime Minister having had that nominee agreed by this House. What my bill in effect seeks to do is to bring this House into the 21st century and replicate the conditions that we find in most other properly functioning representative democracies right around the world, and even what we find in properly functioning representative democracies in the rest of the United Kingdom. In the Scottish Parliament, the First Minister and her Cabinet have to be approved by the Scottish Parliament and MSPs, as do the Welsh and Northern Irish Assemblies. Even the London Assembly works on this basis. It's a process that allows confirmation from Parliament and even alternatives to emerge to see if he or she might have the confidence of the House. What it would do would be to end the current situation where a Prime Minister of this country can be decided by a few thousand members of the Conservative Party. It would end the practice of this House having a Prime Minister foisted upon it without even as much as a take your leave, where the Conservative Association, say, of Tunbridge Wells has more of a say than a directly elected Member of Parliament to determine who the Prime Minister is. And I hear the hears from the Conservative Party member opposite, who obviously enjoy that particular privilege. Let's just have a cursory look at how we had the good fortune to get our current Prime Minister. The current Prime Minister was appointed by Her Majesty as a result of winning the Conservative leadership contest that was triggered by the resignation of the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, who was first appointed Prime Minister on 31st of July 2016 as a result of the resignation of David Cameron as Prime Minister in July 2016. Since 2015, the UK has had 2 Prime Ministers appointed outside of a general election, determined exclusively by the membership of the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom. And looking at the current incumbent, we could only surmise at the efficacy and good sense inherent in the current arrangements. Madam Deputy Speaker, this House must never again have an unelected Prime Minister forced upon it. A Prime Minister must be able to demonstrate that she or he has the confidence of this House at the inception of his or her premiership. My bill will ensure that that will never happen again. And what my bill also does, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to help deal with some of the issues that might unexpectedly arise in the course of a parliamentary term. Just say, for example, a Prime Minister losing a referendum on the European Union and having to resign. This current Prime Minister also actually wiped away his own majority himself by banishing those that disagreed with his hard Brexit from the ranks of the Conservative Party. His government was left in an absolute minority, but yet he was still able to control the order paper of the House of Commons while lacking the ability to pass any meaningful legislation. And then what did he do, Madam Deputy Speaker? He illegally prorogued Parliament to prevent the Brexit purgatory being effectively scrutinised, and he unnecessarily drew the Queen into illegal political proceedings, something that this bill would seek to address and to rectify. Quite frankly, there is no way, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the current Prime Minister would have been approved by this House, as he would not have been able to demonstrate that confidence in the last session of Parliament. And if this procedure was in place, available to us last year, we could only speculate as to whether the UK would be in a better place if we had that facility in place then. So what would trigger this Act? Well, any general election, of course. Any general election under the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act 2011, the Queen accepted the Prime Minister's resignation, the Prime Minister's office becoming vacant for reasons other than resignation, mainly death, the Prime Minister ceasing to be a member of the House of Commons as a result of a recall or crime, which of course we would never imagine would ever happen with this current incumbent. But let's look specifically at one of these examples, because I think it's quite timely and it's quite relevant. All of us are rightly relieved to see the Prime Minister back in such rude health, press-upping his way to his disastrous Brexit. And looking at this epitome of a butcher's dog, it's hard to believe that it was touch and go for him only a few short weeks ago, and thank goodness that the Prime Minister pulled through. But what we found with the Prime Minister's incapacitation was the equivalent of government by headless chicken. Without the Prime Minister's customary decisiveness and note for detail, we actually had no real idea who was running the country. It seemed to be the Foreign Secretary who was in charge by deeming of being the First Secretary, but he executed these responsibilities with all the guile of Emu without the assistance of Rod Hull. His only qualification for that role seemed to be that Dominic Cummings couldn't think of anybody else. Maybe he wouldn't have done the job had we had a Deputy Prime Minister, but of course we no longer have a Deputy Prime Minister. an unpaid, powerless position that sometimes and sometimes not, deputised for the Prime Minister, seems to have gone the same way as Nick Clegg. So what my bill does, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to create the office of Acting Prime Minister to ensure that there is someone accountable for the operation of government until a stricken PM recovers or another is found. But my bill does much more than that. It would seek to ensure that the whole apparatus of government be a matter for this House, that the activities of wider government and all its advisory function and capacity becomes under the responsibility of Parliament. Right now, there seems to be some sort of initiative to reinvent the civil service in the guise of a hard Brexit organisation. There is a politicisation of the civil servants being undertaken, the likes of which we have never seen or encountered in this country before. There is a state apparatus being assembled in the guise of Dominic Cummings, who now effectively runs Whitehall. And we, in this House, have no right of scrutiny or the ability to properly consider all this activity that is going on. The extraordinary sight of a government advisor making a press statement to the country from the Downing Street Rose Garden could be the metaphor in how this country is now actually being governed. So what my bill will do, Madam Deputy Speaker, is to codify certain aspects of the ministerial code to ensure that the whole of government is accountable to this House. Ministers will have a duty to Parliament to account and be held accountable for the policies, decisions and actions of their departments and agencies. My bill would uphold the political impartiality of the civil service and assure that civil servants would not be required to act in any way which would conflict with the Civil Service Code as set out in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. Madam Deputy Speaker, my little bill is simple in scope, but it's ambitious in what it wants to achieve. Our unwritten constitution, designed by convention, needs updated and refreshed, and that should start with the appointment of a Prime Minister and his or her cabinet. We must never again have a Prime Minister nominated without consent of this House. We must start to exert control and authority in what's done in this government's name. This is a sensible and practical bill to bring this House into the 21st century, and I beg to move and commend this bill to this House.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the right honourable gentleman, with his usual skill, introduces a SNP policy which sounds attractive but is completely and utterly useless. And it is tradition, Madam Deputy Speaker, to find something that you agree with the previous speaker. And I do agree totally with the previous speaker when he was gracious enough to say how much this House welcomed the recovery of the Prime Minister after a serious illness. But before dealing with the issues itself, and I don't see a clock running, so am I allowed undoubtable amount of time?
For the avoidance of doubt, no. The honourable gentleman is allowed 10 minutes, and there is a mistake in the clock not running. He now has approximately 8.5 minutes.
So I thought, why is this 10-minute rule bill being introduced now? And what are we actually asking to do today? We're not actually asking to approve the content of the bill. We're asking, do we give leave for the bill to be brought in as a private member's bill? Well, the honourable gentleman could have done that in February. There are 131 bills prior to this bill that members have introduced properly. So I wondered, and I thought, well, let's ask the library. And it says here, from the library, a 10-minute rule bill. 10-minute rule bills are often an opportunity for a member to voice an opinion on a subject or aspect of existing legislation rather than a serious attempt to get a bill passed. And I think, as usual, the House of Commons Library is correct. We have a situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, later tonight we are going to consider Proposition 7 on the order paper, which moves our private members' bills back again. And I agree entirely with the government that it's the proper thing to do given the COVID crisis. But it does mean that we are going to have private members' bills in September, October, November, January, February and March to get through 130 bills.
This is an opportunity to throw out a bill now which would only clog up the system later on. Let me turn to the gist of the bill. It was an interesting way of pretending that sovereignty doesn't exist. Well, sovereignty is the Queen, and the Queen is the sovereign, and the sovereign appoints the Prime Minister. And the gentleman hasn't produced an actual bill. I think what he has in his hand is a dummy bill. And I looked back to see what his previous bill actually said. And he was very careful not to go into the detail. And I'm not surprised. Now, in normal times, if this bill became an Act of Parliament, the House of Commons, with a government majority of 80, would, of course, nominate the leader of their party to be Prime Minister in the normal way. And in fact, I had to go back to April 1940, when we had a Prime Minister who was not the leader of the governing party, and that was only for 6 months during the Second World War. So why is this clever politician introducing this bill? Let's think what his detail says. He says the House of Commons, Madam Deputy Speaker, would nominate the Prime Minister. And I thought, well, that's strange, the House of Commons. And then I looked a bit further. And it is the Speaker of the House of Commons that nominates the Prime Minister after the House votes. And I thought, well, hang on a minute. What would have happened when my right honourable friend from Maidenhead resigned, if that proposition was in place? And we had Speaker Bercow in the chair. And it would not have been impossible to see the situation where the opposition combined to vote for the right honourable member for Islington North. And maybe one or two Conservatives, disenchanted Conservatives, joined that vote. And then Mr. Speaker would be proposing to the Queen that the right honourable member for Islington North was Prime Minister of a Conservative government which nobody on these benches would support, and everyone on those benches. That's a nice try, but honestly, that doesn't work. And for that reason, the bill should not be given leave to proceed. Now, my government is a very fair government, and I doubt if it will interfere with the voting today, because it likes this House to make decisions on principle by the House, not by the whips telling us what to do. But I hope backbench members will oppose, because this 10-minute rule bill was to make a point. It needs to be thrown out now and not to be part of the ongoing private members' bill situation. But the honourable gentleman did move on to two other aspects in his bill which do need more consideration. The one, of course, is what happens if the Prime Minister is incapacitated and who takes over. That's a very fair point. We must always have a Prime Minister. And when the current Prime Minister fell ill, thankfully, just before he was admitted to hospital, the government came up with a schedule of members who would be Prime Minister if something happened to the current Prime Minister. And we had the First Secretary, in fact, becoming effectively Prime Minister. And if the First Secretary had fallen ill, there was a whole list. Now, I already have a bill before this House, the Prime Minister Temporary Replacement Bill, which deals with that. It has a fixed system. So you know in advance what would happen if the Prime Minister is incapacitated. Now, I hope on October the 30th, the honourable gentleman will support that bill. So I think the second part of his bill is not necessary and is flawed, because there would be a delay between the Prime Minister being incapacitated and a new one appointed. Where I find more interest is the situation with the appointment of Cabinet Ministers. Now, under the honourable gentleman's bill, as I understand it, they would have to have the House approval before they could become a Cabinet Minister. And I suppose if you go back a few years, to 1707, when this House introduced the... what happened was you had to resign your seat if you became a cabinet minister. That's not a bad idea. And of course, what happened? Most of those cabinet ministers, they stood for election and they weren't opposed. One or two of them sneaked off to safer seats and took the opportunity at that moment. But whilst I don't suggest that we go back to that, in fact, that ended in 1926 by a private member's bill. A private member's bill ended that situation. But where I do think the honourable gentleman has a point is on the fact that why not have select committees hold confirmation hearings for newly appointed government ministers? Departmental select committees could do this, and they could say whether they thought the person was fit and proper. Now, I'm sure in the case of a Conservative government that would always be the case, but it might not be if we had a Labour government in power, and I wouldn't necessarily say that would be mandatory, but I think it would be a good idea that the select committees look at that. And if the select committees did do that, it will force the government to form select committees much earlier in government than they sometimes do. So there is some merit in those proposals. But the fundamental issue of allowing Speaker Bercow to nominate to the Queen the right honourable gentleman for Islington North, what an absurd idea. And for that alone, leave for this bill should not be granted.
So the question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in his bill. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye! Of the contrary, no. Division, clear the lobby.
I tried you earlier.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Gavin Newlands and David Linden. Tellers for the noes, Peter Bone and William Ragg. I should, for the sake of clarification, we will close the doors 12 minutes after the commencement of the vote, which was 2 minutes and 30 seconds ago.
Yeah.
Lock the doors. Order.
Hopefully.
No. The honourable gentleman ought to be round there, please.
The ayes to the right, 55. The noes to the left, 115.
The ayes to the right, 55. The noes to the left, 115. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. We now come to the motion on the appointment of the Chair of the National Audit Office. Prime Minister to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty, praying that Her Majesty would appoint Dame Fiona Reynolds, DBE, to the office of Chair of the National Audit Office from the 10th of January 2021. Should Her Majesty choose to do so, then Dame Fiona will take over the reins from Lord Bishard. His 2 terms in the post have capped a long and distinguished career in public service, and his departure will leave some rather large shoes to fill in the NAO boardroom, but I believe Dame Fiona is more than capable of filling them, at least metaphorically, Madam Deputy Speaker. She has spent most of her life working to preserve the best of this country, holding senior roles at the Council for National Parks and the campaign to protect rural England. For more than a decade, she was responsible for great swathes of our heritage as Director General of the National Trust. She's worked in central government, sat on the board of institutions including the BBC, and since 2012 has served as Master of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. Alongside all that, she somehow found time to write a book, The Fight for Beauty, described by one reviewer as a warning against thoughtless depredation authorised by policymakers, which in many ways also describes the role of the NAO. So Dame Fiona is perfect for this role, and that is a view shared by the Chair of the Committee of Public Accounts, the Honourable Member for Hackney South, Anne Shoreditch, who, in accordance with the law, has given her seal of approval to the proposed appointment. I'm sure Dame Fiona will do an excellent job, and I commend this motion to the House.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order paper. Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to support the motion as proposed by the Prime Minister to appoint Dame Fiona Reynolds, who, as he has highlighted, has had a distinguished career, particularly as Head of the National Trust and more recently as Master of Emmanuel College, and she is actually, of course, the first woman to hold this important position. And I also put on record my thanks to Lord Bishard for his, will be 6 years of service when he hands over the reins to Dame Fiona in January. And of course, the National Audit Office is critical in holding government to account, safeguarding taxpayers' money, and increasingly, under the new Controller and Auditor General Gareth Davies, helping government learn to do better. So it's heartening that the Prime Minister and I agree on the importance of the National Audit Office and the suitability of Dame Fiona to take up this role. She has considerable experience, which I think will be well played in the National Audit Office. Of course, it is the Controller and Auditor General that determines all the audit procedures, but she will have a pivotal role on the board in making sure that the organisation becomes as modern and sophisticated as it needs to be to deal with the challenges of the modern world. So I fully and wholeheartedly endorse her. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this was also the first virtual appointment. I haven't yet met Dame Fiona, so I look forward to that when lockdown restrictions lift still further. Thank you very much.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to catch your eye, and I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's motion. I declare an interest in this subject because although I wasn't part of the selection process at all, Dame Fiona is a constituent. I do know her, and I've met her on a number of occasions. I think she will make an excellent candidate for the reasons that I'm about to very briefly, my right honourable friend will be grateful to know, adjudicate. She, of course, has had a role in academia. She was recently Master of Emmanuel College, having gained a first at Cambridge. She was, of course, well known as for 10 years as the Director of the National Trust, building their membership from 10 million to 19 million. She was also, as the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee has said, part of government in the Cabinet Office. She formed a new unit which brought the ideas of gender equality to a range of government initiatives. As well as academia, as well as government, as well as NGO, she's had a range of business appointments with Westminster, Wessex Water, Grosvenor Estate, the BBC and John Lewis. So she brings, I think, to this job a wealth of experience. She will bring it an inquiring mind, a highly bright person. She will be there to challenge and work with, I think, on a very excellent basis, our Controller and Auditor General, Gareth Davies. All in all, I think her appointment will be a benefit to this House, a benefit to the government and a benefit to this country. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Alison Thuris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just briefly from our side, that we also welcome the appointment of Dame Fiona Reynolds to the role of Chair of the National Audit Office. We welcome the participation of Caroline Gardner, the Auditor General for Scotland, in the appointment panel, which is good. We are sure that, given her previous role in the Council for National Parks, she will have a good ability to see the wood for the trees and hold the government to account. And I look forward to her doing so with great skill and experience. Thank you.
Sir Edward Lee.
I also welcome this appointment. Clearly, this candidate is very well qualified. For those not familiar with the structure, the NAO board is very different from another board. It doesn't, any other board, any other company, or in the public sector, it doesn't set policy. And when we created the present structure, we made clear that the board would not interfere in the absolute right of the Controller and Auditor General to himself determine what he should investigate. But I just want to make this one comment, that I think this role is going to become increasingly important, because the chair of the board will have to lead it in its decisions to give the NAO adequate resources to deal with the very difficult position that we find ourselves in with public spending and the massive increase in public spending which is going to result as a result of COVID-19. So I think the NAO, for every pound it spends, it saves £9. But there's going to be a lot of work, a lot of extra resources needs to be given to the NAO. And I'll just end with this one comment, that politicians, of course, tend to be obsessed with policy. But efficiency is all the more important when we are rapidly increasing spending. We found when we rapidly increased spending on the NHS under the last Labour government, there was a dramatic decline in productivity. So without getting involved in policy, the Chair and the Controller and Auditor General will have a crucial role in ensuring efficiency. And I can see the Prime Minister sitting in front of me, that he'll want to ensure that he appoints somebody in every department who is a well-qualified finance officer to ensure that as we increase spending, we do not increase waste. Thank you very much.
Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to support the Prime Minister on the motion to appoint Dame Fiona Reynolds as Chairman of the National Audit Office. It's rare this House makes an appointment such as this, and so I wish to add my support as one of the new generation of members in this House. In an era where we spend almost 4 in every £10 of the national income, it's imperative that we spend that effectively. Not to return money back to the Treasury coffers, but so we can deliver the healthcare, the education, the police, the armed forces and the infrastructure that our country needs. Today's appointment is a vital part of how we achieve that. That this House, independent of government, has the ability to draw back the curtain and to see the facts as they are, not as we might wish them to be. And that's a cornerstone of the rule of law under a sovereign parliament. This right dates back centuries, but we owe it in its current form to William Gladstone, a great moderniser and disruptor, who we should note was not unafraid to make changes to the machinery of government in order to deliver for the working people of Britain. Madam Deputy Speaker, I conclude by congratulating the member for Hackney South and Shoreditch for securing a candidate of great calibre and unimpeachable independence. Having devoted much of her life to the world of conservation, Dame Reynolds clearly takes the long view, and I wish her many years of effective service in the knowledge that she has our full support.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. I will suspend the House now for 3 minutes in order to have a safe turnover of personnel and cleanliness at the dispatch box. Order. The House is resumed. I call the Financial Secretary to the Treasury to move the Ways and Means motion.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Programme motion. Minister to move. The question is the Finance Bill Programme number 2 motion as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Finance Bill as amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
You have to say now.
Now.
We will start with Amendment 18 to Clause 71, with which it will be convenient to debate Amendment 19, New Clause 5 and New Clause 33. I should draw the House's attention to the fact that a corrected text of New Clause 33 has been published this morning. The version that was initially published inadvertently omitted the concluding subsection. To move Amendment 18, I call Bridget Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to move Amendment 18 and to speak to Amendment 19. These amendments would require the Treasury to conduct a review of the digital services tax within a year of royal assent and to report to Parliament on the tax annually thereafter, with a specific consideration of the effect of this measure on taxation revenue. We welcome the introduction of the digital services tax, although this support is qualified, and the Minister will be well aware that while we like to be thorough, even with proposals we broadly welcome. It's deeply disappointing that it has not been possible to reach multinational international agreement, hence the need for this unilateral approach. This government should demonstrate much more leadership in pressing for international efforts to tackle this scourge. Ensuring that companies which operate across national borders pay the tax that they should requires us to cooperate, to lead, to persuade, to negotiate and to set an example. More troubling is the fact that in this crisis we are living through today, when ambitious and decisive action is demanded of government, ministers have only managed to put forward such a modest measure when other countries are willing to go further. Many of the companies that will be affected by this tax are the same ones that will have benefited from the impact of COVID-19. Before this pandemic struck, they were the beneficiaries of an uneven playing field, while much-loved high street businesses struggled. Local firms and UK chains have faced a real battle competing with those companies that base themselves overseas, don't have the same overheads as physical shops and go to great lengths to minimise their tax liabilities. The impact of lockdown has only exacerbated this tension. It has provided an unexpected boon to tech giants who have managed to rake it in as demand soars and business is directed online. Meanwhile, our high street businesses, which were already struggling, have only seen their worries increase as footfall has understandably plummeted. Even with the easing of lockdown, there is a real challenge ahead in ensuring that the continued success of our bricks and mortar retail sector. If shoppers won't venture onto our high streets, and if the government fails to provide an effective test, track and isolate system, many businesses that are just starting to open up will soon be forced to close their doors again, perhaps even permanently. These are businesses that are the bedrock of our communities. They help create a sense of place and are often a lifeline for older and vulnerable residents and for those in more isolated communities. Government must do more to ensure that there is a level playing field and that those who have benefited the most from this situation, as I've noted, those who've not exactly paid their fair share in the past, make more of a contribution to the national effort. I'm happy to give way.
Would she accept that not only is it right that the government intervene to ensure that taxes are paid for a level playing field, but at a time when public finances are under pressure, we should not be allowing tax revenue which is due and should be paid for large firms to escape from paying it?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. He's absolutely right in what he says, and I sincerely hope that the Minister will respond to that point, because we have seen this unfairness built into our system. We recognise that this measure takes some steps towards levelling that playing field, but we need to see much more from government in clamping down on the kind of tax avoidance that we've seen far too often in recent years, because it isn't right.
I'm very grateful for the Honourable Lady giving way, and can I say how much I support the argument she's making. Does she agree with me that the government's measure on the digital service tax is actually a mouse of a measure compared to the huge profits made by American big tech? Would she also agree with me that the government needs to cooperate very closely with the European Union, who are devising an international tax with much greater teeth, so that these big tech companies do pay their fair share of tax?
Richard Phillipson.
Yes, I would support the point that the right honourable gentleman makes, and I'll come on to more of that in future in my contribution, both in terms of how they need to contribute more, but how it's also essential that we do see international consensus on this issue, because the measure the government has put forward today is necessarily time limited. However, we will need to see a much more sustainable long-term solution with a broader international base. Because it isn't right that British bookstores and other businesses face a higher tax rate than Amazon. And unfortunately, this measure does not go far enough to address this fundamental unfairness. Nor does it really get to the heart of the tax avoidance strategies some of these tech companies have used in recent years. As the Chartered Institute of Taxation points out, this measure is not aimed at stopping profits arising in the UK being shifted by multinationals out of the UK to tax havens. But for far too long, the companies which make the modern economy work have got away with complex ways of moving and hiding the money that we pay them. I'll have to give way.
I'm very grateful. I agree with many of the points you make, certainly in making sure we have a fair and level playing field for small businesses. And certainly I'm a supporter of new clause 33 in principle, trying to see these multinationals disclose profits on a country-by-country basis. But does she, to be fair, accept the fact that the government has gone further than previous governments with measures like the diverted profit tax and now by the digital services tax? Yeah.
We welcome all measures, and we would support any proposals to tackle tax avoidance, whether it's in terms of tech giants or much more broadly. But we do still face a big gap in this country, and we are urging government to do much more, and I'm sure that he would agree. It's vital that we see greater action, because we have seen this unfairness, particularly during the pandemic. He, like me, will have many wonderful local businesses that pay their taxes, are trying to come through this crisis, and they want to make sure that there is a level playing field between the bricks and mortar businesses and online businesses too, and I'm sure we all want to try and get behind that endeavour. For too long, companies have moved and hidden the money we pay them. And research by TaxWatch UK estimates that we are losing £1.3 billion in corporation tax from 5 of the biggest firms each year. Now, comparing that with the government's own estimate that the digital services tax is only set to produce £280 million this financial year, the modest nature of this measure becomes clear when we consider what some of the tech giants might actually have to pay under the tax. And I highlight again for the benefit of the House, as I did in committee, research by TaxWatch UK, which predicts that Facebook would face an increased tax bill of £39 million despite estimated UK revenues of almost £2.3 billion. Google would pay slightly more, around £168 million, based on estimated UK tax revenues of £9.3 billion. And many businesses, such as Amazon, which blend their activities, will be unaffected by the measure. Now, the government will be aware of our concerns that streaming services are not included at all, a point which we raised and discussed at committee stage. Now, the Minister then said in his response that it would be inappropriate to implement a temporary tax on a broader basis. And he will doubtless be aware that taxes introduced on a temporary basis have ended up becoming permanent fixtures, including, I'm told, income tax introduced to fund war with Napoleon. And with little evidence that the government is working to secure international agreement for a replacement for this tax, temporary could end up being for a very long time. Now, HMRC employs many extremely capable people, and I'm sure it's not beyond their wit to develop a way of taxing streaming services too. I'd also like to touch on new clause 33 here, Madam Deputy Speaker. The new clause tabled in the name of my right honourable friend for Barking and with many cross-party supporters, which would introduce a provision that those liable to the digital services tax must publish a country-by-country tax report. Now, my right honourable friend, the member for Barking, has campaigned tirelessly and incredibly effectively on this issue, and I wish it were possible that we could hear from her directly today. Sadly, the way in which we now conduct our proceedings makes it impossible for my right honourable friend to contribute, which is a real shame given the expertise and insight she brings on this issue. But I'm aware that the cross-party support on this new clause will allow other speakers to raise those points that she might have sought to make in debate. For years from these benches, we have urged the government to commit to country-by-country reporting on a public basis. Its reticence to do so, and the way in which it has held up progress at an international level, has been a source of deep frustration to those of us who want to see far greater transparency around the taxation of multinational companies. Not only would this new clause be of practical use, so that we can see if those liable to the digital services tax are paying an appropriate amount, but it also helps to address the concerns that I've outlined, that the measure as it stands does little to address the tax avoidance practices by digital multinational companies. It would end the secrecy around such practices and would pave the way for public country-by-country reporting at a wider level. I know the government has been fond in recent months of saying that it wishes to be a world leader. Well, here is the opportunity to become a world leader in tax transparency, and I urge the Minister to listen to the arguments being made in this area and take urgent action to address them. The pressure on our public finances and vital frontline services means we should be doing far more to ensure that those tech companies which have benefited from the lockdown are contributing more. We need a level playing field between our high streets and the tech giants. We need to build a society where everyone, individuals and businesses alike, pays their fair share. A digital services tax must be a part of that, but the government simply isn't